Welcome to Dickensian Sleep Story, and welcome too to this quiet hour when the day has done its very best and may now be gently set aside. Let your attention soften as if you were drawing a curtain against the draft. Take a slow, comfortable breath in through the nose and let it out as though you were sighing into a pillow. Unclench your jaw if it has been holding on to any small worries. Let your tongue rest easy. Allow your shoulders to drop down and away from your ears until they feel pleasantly heavy, as though a warm shawl has been laid across them. Settle a little deeper into your blankets. Feel the weight of them, kind, steady, reassuring. Let your hands rest where they wish, uncurled and unhurried. If your brow is furrowed smooth, it with a thought as gentle as a palm. Another slow breath, in and out. And with that breath, imagine the bustle of the world becoming muffled as if snow had fallen upon it, or fog had folded itself thickly over the streets. And as you grow comfortable, I'll ask you something simple, something cozy. Where are you listening from tonight? If these Victorian sleep stories bring you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, picture a spring evening in old London when the season is trying its best to be mild, yet cannot quite resist sending a chill along the river streets. When fog drifts through gaslight and hearth warmth glows behind curtained windows in Southwark, making the cobbles shine as though they have been polished by time itself. In Victorian London, a Dickensian sleep story begins beneath fog and gaslight, while hearth warmth breathes softly from a row of boarding-house windows. The rain is only a fine, patient mist, hardly more than a whisper against the lamps. Yet it lends the world a clean, lullaby sheen. Eleanor Strake had always found that Southwark at this hour possessed two selves. There was the outward self-streets pale with damp, the faint slosh of carriage wheels, the river's breath wandering inland as a cool ribbon. And there was the inward self, those little squares of light in windows, those hidden rooms where kettles murmured and coals settled and someone's supper gave off the mildest scent of pepper and onion. She lived as modest clerks often did in a boarding house that had seen more seasons than it cared to remember. It stood with a certain resigned respectability behind its narrow railings, its paintwork forever deciding whether it wished to be gray or brown. Inside it was warmer than it looked, not from any grand prosperity, but from the simple fact that many small hearths in many small rooms had been coaxed to life, and their warmth crept into the bones of the place. Eleanor's own room was on the second floor, with a window that would not quite meet its frame, and a washstand whose jug was always cool to the touch. She did not mind these things. She was a calm, conscientious soul, and she had a fondness for objects that did their best. That evening, she had stayed a little later at her desk than usual by the light of a single candle and the respectful glow that rose from the grate. Her hands accustomed to ink and columns moved with quiet certainty as she made one last neat note in her little household book, nothing grand, only a tally of what was owed, what was paid, what must be remembered. It pleased her, this small order. It made the world feel forgivable. Forgiveness was a thing she thought about more than she spoke of. Not in any dramatic way. Eleanor had no taste for dramatic ways, but in the manner of a person who, having once made a small mistake, carries the memory of it like a pin tucked into a cuff. Some weeks ago, at the counting house where she worked, she had mislaid a receipt for half a day. It had turned up, as most lost things do, in the most obvious place, under the blotter of all things. Yet the flutter of anxiety it caused her had left an imprint. No one had shouted. No one had been cruel. Her superior had only lifted his eyebrows and said with weary civility, "Do mind it, Miss Strake." Still, Eleanor had felt as though she'd been seen through, like thin paper held to a lamp. Since then, she had longed quietly, persistently, to do one small kindness, neatly from beginning to end, as a sort of gentle counterweight. Not to purchase anyone's pardon, as if pardon could be bought, but to remind her own heart that she was not only her errors, that she might also be her care. A faint clink sounded from the landing outside, and then the soft shuffle of slippers. Mrs. Belling, the landlady, passed Eleanor's door with a candle cupped in her palm. The warm smell of toasted bread drifted behind her like a friendly ghost. "Eleanor," Mrs. Belling murmured, pausing with a whisper of skirts. "Yes, Mrs. Belling." Eleanor answered at once, as though she had been waiting to be useful. "There's coal enough, love." "Oh, yes," Eleanor said, though she rose to check for the pleasure of certainty. She opened the little iron mouth of the grate and looked in. The coals lay like miniature black hills, their edges bruised with red. The sound they made was one of those domestic sounds a person scarcely notices until it is gone, a tiny settling, a quiet, contented ticking, as though time itself had warmed and decided to take its rest by the fire. "I counted them," Eleanor said, with the faintest smile, surprising herself. Mrs. Belling gave a soft, pleased snort. "Counted them, did you? There's a clerk for you. Well, don't count too careful. Share them with the night. That's what I say." It was said lightly, yet it struck Eleanor as wise. Share them with the night. She closed the grate and felt for a moment as though the warmth in the room had turned kind. When Mrs. Belling moved on, Eleanor gathered her shawl and decided to take down her empty cup to the kitchen. It was a small errand, and she might have waited until morning, but the very idea of leaving it undone made her mind feel untidy. Besides, the stairwell of the boarding house had a particular comfort at night. Warmth seeped into it from each room, as if the walls themselves had learned to be hospitable. She stepped into the corridor and drew her door gently shut. The house was quiet in that way. Old houses are quiet, never fully still, but murmuring to itself in its sleep. A distant clock ticked in the parlor below. Somewhere a chair creaked as if shifting its weight. The air in the stairwell held the mingled scents of coal smoke soap and last week's lavender. As Eleanor descended, her fingertips brushed the banister, worn smooth by countless hands, polished by time into a dark, patient shine. On the first landing, a little niche held a framed print of St. Paul's rising out of mist. Someone, perhaps Mrs. Belling, had placed a small sprig of something green beneath it, as though even a picture deserved a touch of life. At the bottom, near the front door, the boarding house kept a square of warmth. A little hearth in the parlor to the left glowed through a half-open door, and the heat found its way into the hall like a welcome that did not require words. Eleanor paused there, cradling the comfort of it for just a breath. Then she unlatched the front door and stepped out into Southwark's evening. The air met her with cool politeness. It was early spring, yet the river had not released winter entirely. It held on to it in damp stone and misted breath. The street was quiet, not empty but subdued, like a church between hymns. Gas lamps stood at intervals, their flames hissing gently, each one surrounded by a halo where the fog turned gold. Eleanor pulled her shawl closer and made to cross the small pavement to the side passage that led toward the kitchen entrance. She had taken only 2 steps when she noticed beneath the nearest lamp a small shape upon the stones. At first, she thought it might be a scrap of cloth fallen from a bundle, but as she drew nearer, she saw it was a mitten woolen gray-brown with a darker cuff that looked as though it had been mended more than once. It lay palm up under the gaslight, as if the hand that once wore it had set it down in a moment's distraction and forgotten to return. The mitten looked lonely, in a way that tugged at Eleanor's heart. Perhaps because it was meant to be worn to be warmed by a living hand. Perhaps because it seemed such a minor loss, and yet on a damp evening like this, minor losses could feel very large to the person who suffered them. She stooped and lifted it carefully. The wool was slightly rough, the sort that holds warmth stubbornly. A faint scent clung to it, coal smoke, and something else. Something domestic starch, perhaps. Or the ghost of a clean drawer. Eleanor turned it over in her fingers. Inside the cuff, someone had stitched 2 neat initials in dark thread. They were small, but clear in the lamp's glow. E.H. Eleanor's breath made a pale cloud as she read them, and she felt the smallest stirring of purpose. Not urgency. No, nothing so sharp, but a calm, steady inclination, like a kettle beginning to warm. She looked up and down the street. A distant figure moved through the fog coat collar high, but did not seem to search the ground. A carriage passed at a respectful pace, its wheels making the damp stones sigh. From within the boarding house came a muffled laugh, quickly softened by the door. "No one has missed you yet," Eleanor murmured to the mitten, as though it might hear. "But they will." She returned inside and carried the mitten to the kitchen, where the fire was banked low, and a kettle sat with its lid on as if dozing. Mrs. Belling was there, folding a cloth, her sleeves rolled with brisk competence. "Mrs. Belling," Eleanor said softly, "has anyone in the house lost a mitten?" Mrs. Belling looked up, squinting in the lamplight. "A mitten, Lord, bless me, no. Not in this house, love." We'd all have heard the lamentations. Mittens are like umbrellas. You don't miss them until you're already wet. Eleanor smiled because it was true. It was under the gas lamp. "Then it belongs to the street," Mrs. Belling declared. "And the street will not come looking." "You've a tender heart, Eleanor Strake." Eleanor hesitated. "I thought perhaps I could return it. The initials are E.H. Mrs. Belling's eyebrows rose. "E.H. Is it? Well, there's Mrs. Hargreaves in the next row, but she's an A. H, if she's anything. And there's little Edwin Hart at the cobbler's, but he'd lose his own nose if it weren't attached." Eleanor ran her thumb along the cuff. The stitches were careful, as though made by someone who liked things put right. "If you take it out," Mrs. Belling went on in a tone that suggested she knew Eleanor would go warm yourself proper. "The fog gets into your bones like a notion." "I'll be careful," Eleanor promised. She returned to the hall, tucked the mitten into her reticule, and stepped back out beneath the lamp's mild hiss. The fog seemed thicker now, or perhaps her attention had grown more attuned to it. It drifted in slow folds, making the world feel smaller, more intimate, as though the city had leaned in to speak quietly. Eleanor did not know where to begin, but she knew Southwark, in the way a modest clerk knows her own roots, by habit, by necessity, by the gentle geography of errands. There was a tea shop not far off near a corner, where the lamplight fell kindly, and where one might ask a question without feeling foolish. And beyond that, nearer the river, there was a small chapel with a gatehouse alcove that kept a steady lamp burning even when the street lamps sputtered. She walked at an unhurried pace, listening to the soft sounds of evening, the faint clop of a horse somewhere in the mist, the distant call of a watchman, the low murmur of voices behind curtained windows. Her boots made a restrained tap upon the cobbles, as if they too were trying not to disturb anyone's rest. At the corner, by the ironmonger's shop, she paused to look at a posted bill, though she did not read it. It was simply a place to stand, a place to consider. And while she stood there, a voice bright as a penny and twice as quick spoke from beside the lamp-post. "Evening, miss. You look like you've misplaced the whole of London." Eleanor turned with a small start that quickly softened. A boy stood there, perhaps 14 or 15, though it was difficult to tell in the fog. He wore a cap at a jaunty angle and a coat that had seen better days but was held together with the stubborn pride of careful mending. His eyes shone with mischief that seemed on closer inspection to be the harmless sort mischief that wanted only to make the world a touch less dull. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said, polite as a prayer. "No pardon needed, the boy replied, grinning. "I hand 'em out free, I do. Name's Dawkins. Jack Dawkins, if we're being formal, which we ain't. Folks call me the Artful Dodger, but that's just because I'm good at avoiding puddles. What want your shoes for supper?" He stepped neatly around a shining patch of water as if demonstrating. Eleanor found herself smiling despite the damp. "I'm not misplaced," she said. "Only looking for the owner of something." "Well, that's a respectable sort of hunt," the boy declared, as though he approved of hunts only when they involved kindness. Lost cat, lost purse, lost temper. "A lost mitten," Eleanor said, and drew it carefully from her reticule. The Dodger's expression changed, not into anything solemn, for he did not seem made for solemnity, but into something attentive. He leaned closer, letting the gaslight catch the wool. "Ooh," he murmured. "That's a proper mitten, that is. Warm as a sermon. Where'd you find it?" "Under the gas lamp." "By my boarding house," Eleanor said. "It has initials E.H. I thought perhaps someone nearby." "E.H." The Dodger repeated, tapping his lip with a finger as if the initials were a riddle. "Could be, anyone could. But I've seen those stitches before. Not the letters, mind, just the way the thread's pulled. Neat. Careful. Like someone who don't like leaving things half done." Eleanor's heart gave a small, pleased thump. "That's what I thought." "Course you did," the Dodger said, as if it were obvious. "You've got the look of someone what lines up their teacups. Now, if you want to ask about a mitten without shouting it at the fog, you want Mrs. Plume's tea shop, you do. Window seat. Kettle always on. If anyone's seen an E.H. frettin', it'll be her." He tipped his cap with flourish. "Come on, I'll point you. Fog's a tricky old aunt, likes to turn you round without telling you." Eleanor hesitated because she had been taught to be cautious, and because she did not know this boy. Yet there was something in his manner, an ease, a buoyant friendliness that made him feel like part of the street's better nature. Besides, he offered only directions, and his eyes held no shadow of threat. "Very well," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Dawkins." "Jack," he corrected cheerfully. "Mr. Dawkins makes me feel like I ought to own a chair what matches." They walked together, the Dodger half a step ahead, as if he were leading her through a map only he could see. He talked as they went, not loudly, not in a way that would startle the night, but with the soft brightness of a person who believed conversation was a small lamp in itself. "Southwark's got its moods," he said. Some nights it's all smoke and sighs. Other nights it's sausages and singing. Tonight it's a Mitten night. You can tell. How can you tell? Eleanor asked, amused. Because the fog's sittin' low like it wants to listen, and the lamps are hissin' like kettles, and you miss. Sorry, Eleanor, ain't it? Eleanor blinked. How did you? You look like an Eleanor, he said promptly, as if it were the simplest logic. All careful and quiet, like you'd apologize to a book if you turned the page too sharp. Eleanor laughed, softly, surprised by the sound of it. It felt nice, like warmth returning to her fingertips. Mrs. Plume's tea shop announced itself not with grandeur, but with invitation. A small window shone out onto the street, its glass slightly fogged from the warmth inside. Behind it, a kettle steamed, and a row of buns sat under a cloth like sleepy children. A bell above the door gave a gentle tinkle as Eleanor entered, the sound immediately swallowed by cozy air. Inside, the world was golden. A little stove glowed in the corner, and the scent of tea leaves and warm sugar wrapped itself around Eleanor's shoulders. The window seat the Dodger had mentioned was occupied by a boy of about Eleanor's own height, when seated though he was younger, thin, earnest, with a gentle face that seemed made for quiet kindness. He held a cup in both hands, as if warming not only his fingers, but his thoughts. His eyes lifted as the door chimed, and Eleanor felt something in his look that calmed her at once. It was not curiosity nor judgment, only a mild, attentive warmth, like a hearth that never flares too high. Evening, Oliver, the Dodger, called as though greeting an old friend. The boy by the window smiled, small, sincere. Good evening, Dodger. Then his gaze moved to Eleanor, and he stood politely setting his cup down with care. Good evening, ma'am. Eleanor colored faintly at the ma'am, though she supposed she was in a manner. Good evening, she said. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Oliver replied, his voice soft as the steam from the kettle. Please, won't you sit? It's warmer by the window, and the rain looks colder from there. Mrs. Plume, a round woman, with a cap like a cloud, appeared behind the counter. Dodger, she said not unkindly, don't you go bringing the fog in on your shoulders. Wipe your boots. They're spotless, the Dodger declared, and wiped them anyway for the pleasure of being agreeable. Eleanor took the window seat, and the warmth of it seemed to settle in her bones. She drew out the mitten and placed it upon the little table as reverently as if it were a teacup that might chip. I found this, she said, under a gas lamp. It belongs to someone with initials E.H. Have you heard anyone speak of a lost mitten? Mrs. Plume leaned over, peering. E.H., she repeated. Well, there's Elspeth Hardy, works over by the chapel, helps with the little gatehouse. Always got a basket of clean cloths. She comes in now and again, for tea when the evening's damp. Oliver's face brightened with recognition. I know her, he said, and there was genuine fondness in the words. She's very kind. She once gave me a warm roll when I looked cold. The Dodger puffed up. See, told you the tea shop knows. Eleanor felt that steady inclination grow clearer. The chapel gatehouse, she said, as though repeating a destination on a familiar map. Mrs. Plume poured her a cup without asking the way a kind place does. You'll want to take that tea with you, love. Fog like this makes a person's thoughts go all twisty. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup. The warmth traveled into her palms, like comfort finding its proper home. Oliver watched her with gentle concern. Are you all right? He asked. You look as though you're carrying something more than a mitten. Eleanor's throat tightened a fraction, but in the comforting air of the tea shop, And under Oliver's quiet, honest gaze, it did not feel frightening. It felt safe. "I only," she said softly, choosing her words with care, "I only like to see things returned. That's all." Oliver nodded as if he understood that "that's all" sometimes held a great deal. The Dodger clapped his hands once very lightly, as if not to disturb the stove. Right then, Mission Mitten, Destination Chapel. We'll have it back on the proper hand before anyone's had time to curse the whole of spring. Eleanor smiled into her tea. The idea of spring being cursed because of a mitten was absurd, and yet, in its absurdity, it felt oddly true. Small discomforts could sour a whole evening. Small kindnesses could sweeten it again. Mrs. Plume set a little bun on a plate and nudged it toward Eleanor. "For the road," she said. "I can't," Eleanor began, then stopped. Refusing kindness sometimes felt like refusing forgiveness, and she was tired of that habit. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Oliver rose too, taking up his own cap. "May I come?" he asked quietly. "Elspeth Hardy. She's been worried lately, I think. Not about a mitten, about other things." Eleanor looked at him, surprised by the tenderness of his thought. "Of course," she said, "if you wish." The Dodger grinned. "There you are. 3 of us. Fog won't stand a chance." They stepped back into the street together, the tea shop's warmth clinging to their clothes like a blessing. The fog met them again, cool and gentle, and the gas lamps made little suns of themselves in the mist. As they walked, Eleanor found her breathing had slowed. The city did not feel hostile. It felt hushed, as if it were listening to their footsteps and approving their purpose. The chapel stood a little apart from the bustle, its stones dark with damp. A low wall and iron gate marked its boundary, and near the gatehouse there was an alcove, small, sheltered, with a steady gas lamp fixed above it. The lamp's light did not hiss so sharply here. It seemed steadier, calmer, as though the chapel itself had taught it patience. In the alcove sat a basket covered with cloth. A broom leaned nearby, and on a little bench, tucked close to the wall, was a woman in a plain shawl. Her hands folded as if she were trying to keep them warm by will alone. Elspeth Oliver said softly. The woman looked up, startled, then relieved. She was not old, but her face carried that look. Some faces carry the look of a person who has been responsible for too many small things too long. Her eyes flicked to the mitten in Eleanor's hand, and her mouth parted in a quiet, grateful sound. "Oh," she breathed, "you found it." Eleanor stepped forward, heart steady. "It was under a gas lamp in the street," she said, and offered it as one offers a restored piece of oneself. "I saw the initials and hoped I might return it." Elspeth took it with both hands, pressing it lightly to her chest, as if it were more than wool. "Thank you," she said. "Truly. I'd been so vexed with myself. I thought, how could I be so careless, leaving it behind of all things?" The Dodger tilted his head, suddenly gentle. "Easy now," he said. "Things slip. Even clever folks drop mittens." Elspeth gave a small, shaky laugh. It wasn't only the mitten, she confessed, voice low, beneath the steady lamp. "It's been one small mistake after another. A cloth left in the wrong place. A key set down and forgotten. And I keep thinking it means something about me, that I'm failing." Eleanor felt those words land quietly in her own chest, like a coal settling in the grate. She understood them too well. Oliver stepped closer. "It doesn't mean that," he said, earnest and soft. "It only means you're tired. And maybe you're carrying worries you don't deserve to carry alone." Elspeth's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back, as though not wishing to disturb the lamp. "I oughtn't to be so upset," she said. "It's only a mitten." "No," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "It isn't only that. It's the feeling that you've done wrong and that you won't be forgiven, even by yourself." Elspeth looked at her then properly, as if seeing her for the first time. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it." The fog drifted around the gate, and the lamp held steady. And for a moment, the world seemed reduced to this little alcove of light, this small, sacred pocket where people could admit the truth in quiet voices. The Dodger cleared his throat, suddenly shy of sincerity. "Well," he said, "if you want a place where folks are good at forgiving and at finding lost bits and pieces, you want Fagin's shop. Warm as a baker's oven it is, full of odds and ends what all got their stories. He'll tell you, too, that a lost mitten ain't a crime. It's just a mitten what took itself a little walk." Elspeth's mouth twitched into a smile. "Fagin's curiosity shop." Oliver nodded. "He's kind," he said simply, "and he listens." Eleanor felt the shape of the evening widening not in difficulty, but in comfort, as if the path of kindness had more lanterns along it than she'd expected. Elspeth tucked the mitten into her shawl, then hesitated. Would you come with me?" she asked, a little ashamed of needing company. "Of course," Eleanor said at once. "And I'll come," Oliver added, gentle as ever. The Dodger gave a flourishing bow to the gas lamp. "Then it's settled," he declared. "Off to Fagin's, where the kettle never sulks and the fire never judges." They walked together through Southwark's softened streets, the fog turning every lamplit corner into a small theater of gold. The rain remained only a suggestion, a fine hush upon the world. Somewhere a bell chimed the hour, and the sound traveled slowly, as though it too did not wish to hurry. Fagin's curiosity shop announced itself by warmth before it announced itself by sight. Eleanor smelled it, first tea-old wood, a faint spice of cinnamon, and the particular comforting tang of coal that has been burning steadily for hours. Then she saw the windows crowded with objects that caught the light, little brass buttons, polished stones, a cracked music box with its lid open like a mouth mid-song, and a row of mismatched teacups that looked as though they had gathered there for a friendly argument. The door opened with a soft jingle of bells, and the warmth rolled out like a shawl thrown around the shoulders. Inside the shop was a world of lamplight and gentle clutter. Shelves rose to the ceiling, each one crammed with curios, nothing grand, nothing frightening. Only the sort of things that had been lost, found, saved, repaired and loved again. Ribbons, spectacles, old postcards, bits of lace, tiny carved animals, pocket watches that no longer kept time but still gleamed as if they tried. And near the center, by a small stove and a table set with cups, stood Fagin himself, an older man with bright eyes and quick hands, his face lined not with bitterness, but with the kind of lively curiosity that comes from paying attention to the world's small wonders. "Well, well," he said, in a voice like a warm chuckle. "If it isn't my evening visitors, Oliver, my dear boy Dodger, you've brought me the fog on your cap again. And who is this, a lady with a careful look, and another with a worried heart?" Eleanor felt herself blush as if her nature had been politely named. Oliver stepped forward. "Good evening, Fagin," he said. "We've come with something found, and perhaps with something that needs setting right. Fagin's eyes twinkled, but his tone softened. "Ah," he said, "setting right. That's a fine trade, that is. Come in, shut the door, and keep the warmth where it belongs. Kettle's on, chairs are friendly, and the night outside can go on hissing at its lamps without us." Eleanor stepped fully into the shop, and as the door clicked shut behind them, the fog and damp seemed to fall away, left on the threshold like a coat. The lamplight glowed. The stove murmured. Somewhere, a tiny clock ticked, content with its own small duty. And for the first time all evening, Eleanor felt that her longing to leave one small kindness neatly done before nightfall had found not only a purpose, but companions. Fagin, having made his hospitable pronouncement, set about proving it with the brisk tenderness of a man who believed warmth was best offered before it was requested. He tugged a kettle nearer the stove, with a little hook adjusted the flame, and set out cups as mismatched as friends one with a crack, like a thin smile, one painted with faded roses, one plain and sturdy as a good coat. "Sit, sit," he urged, shooing them toward the table, as though it were a nest, and they were birds who had forgotten they were allowed to rest. "The night's all damp persuasion out there. In here we've got tea to argue with it." Eleanor lowered herself onto a chair that creaked in polite surprise. The heat from the stove pressed gently against her shins. On the table, a little oil lamp burned with a steady devotion. Its light fell on the objects around them and made each one seem to have a story worth telling, even if the story was no more than "I was once lost, and now I am found." Oliver sat opposite her, hands folded around his cup as if he were thanking it. The Dodger perched sideways on his chair, as though sitting properly might be a form of deception, and Elspeth hovered for a moment before settling her shoulders, still drawn up around her ears in that way of a person who has been bracing for reproach. Fagin poured tea. The kettle sighed. The cups warmed. Somewhere behind them, among shelves of ribbons and buttons, a tiny wind-up bird clicked its beak twice, and then fell silent again as if satisfied. "Now," Fagin said, leaning his elbows on the table with the familiarity of a kindly uncle, "I'm told there's something found and something to be set right. Those are my favorite categories. Nothing too large, mind large things are a nuisance. But small things are where the heart keeps its housekeeping." Eleanor glanced at the mitten, which had been placed on the table between them, like a modest guest. "Found under a gas lamp," the Dodger said promptly. "Eleanor, here's on a noble errand. Brought it to Elspeth at the chapel gatehouse, she did. Then we all came here because the fog started looking like it wanted to keep it." Fagin's bright eyes moved to Eleanor. "A clerk," he observed not unkindly. "I can tell. The calm look, the tidy hands, the habit of finishing what you begin." Eleanor felt herself color. I don't like loose ends," she said softly. "Loose ends make people itch." Fagin agreed gravely, as if discussing wool. Then he reached out and drew the mitten toward him with care. He turned it over, thumb stroking the cuff. "Good wool," he murmured, "properly spun. And initials, E.H. That narrows it down to half of London." He glanced up. His mouth quirked. "But will not despair. Despair is draughty." Elspeth set her cup down, fingers trembling slightly. "I thought it was mine," she admitted. "My name, Elspeth Hardy. I saw the letters, and I thought, of course, it must be me being so careless." Oliver's gaze softened. "You were very hard on yourself," he said gently, as though the words were a warm cloth. Elspeth swallowed. "I am tired," she confessed, as if it were the most private thing. Fagin nodded, with such understanding that Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "Tired makes a person misplace more than mittens," he said. "Tired misplaces hope and patience, and the nice little belief that we are allowed to be human." The Dodger shifted suddenly quieter. "We're all human," he muttered, as if that fact had been argued with him before. Fagin set the mitten down and rose. "I've an idea," he announced, and reached into a tin by the stove. He brought out a small pile of coal. No, not lumps of coal, but little black beads, smooth as if tumbled by a river. They looked like coal, but they were polished, curious things, each one about the size of a fingernail. The Dodger's eyes lit. "Oh, the counting coals." Eleanor counted coals in her grate. Oliver said, almost shyly, as if repeating a tender detail. Eleanor blinked, only to see if there was enough. "And was there?" Fagin asked, tipping the beads into his palm. "There was," Eleanor said. "Then you see," Fagin replied, "counting does not have to mean holding tight. Sometimes counting is simply noticing. Now." He set the little coal beads in a line on the table the way a clerk might set out coins. "Here in my shop, when the night feels heavy, we play a small game. We count coals not to hoard them, but to share them." Elspeth looked uncertain. "How?" Fagin pointed toward the stove, where the fire glowed steadily. "Each of us takes one coal," he said, "and places it in the little dish by the kettle. And when we do, we say one thing. Just one about what we wish to forgive. Forgive ourselves. Forgive the weather. Forgive the past for being stubborn. Nothing grand. Just a small untying." The Dodger pretended to examine his nails. "It ain't soppy," he warned Eleanor, as though she might worry. "It's only warm," Oliver said. Eleanor's throat felt suddenly tight, but not in a painful way. In a relieved way, like a door quietly unlatched. Fagin held out his palm. "Will you?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated only a moment, then reached forward and took one of the little coal beads. It was cool and smooth, grounding in her fingers. Elspeth took one too, and Oliver and the Dodger, who did it as though it were a dare he intended to win. Fagin went first, because hosts often do. He stood by the stove, lifted the kettle slightly, and slid his coal bead into the dish beneath it. The tiny sound it made, a soft clink, was strangely satisfying. "I forgive myself," Fagin said, voice low, "for keeping too many things. For thinking that if I gather enough lost objects, I might keep loss from happening." He returned to his chair with the faintest shrug, as if to say, "They're done." Elspeth went next. She rose and placed her bead in the dish hand, steadying as she moved. "I forgive myself," she whispered, "for being tired, for dropping things, not because I don't care, but because I care so much my hands are full." Oliver's eyes shone with something like gratitude. Then Oliver stood. He moved carefully, as if he did not wish to startle the warmth, and placed his bead. "I forgive myself," he said, voice quiet, "for needing kindness, for thinking I must earn it by being small." The room seemed to soften around that sentence. Even the Dodger's usual grin faded into something gentler. The Dodger rose with a theatrical sigh, as if forgiveness were an inconvenient coat he was required to wear. He placed his bead with a little flourish. "I forgive myself," he announced, "for talking too much, and for being what folks call troublesome, when I'm only trying to be useful." Fagin's eyes twinkled. "Useful is an excellent ambition," he said. Eleanor held her bead a moment longer than the others had. It felt heavy, though it could not have weighed more than a crumb. The fire crackled softly, and the kettle began to murmur, and Eleanor's mind drifted, as it often did at night, toward her small mistake at the counting house. The raised eyebrows, the heat in her cheeks, the way she had carried it home as if it were a stain. She rose and walked to the stove. Her shoes made almost no sound on the shop's worn boards. She slid the bead into the dish. "I forgive myself," she said, and her voice was steady for being imperfect, for misplacing one thing and thinking it meant I was careless in my soul. When she returned to her seat, she felt lighter, as though the fog outside had loosened its grip on her thoughts. Fagin poured a fresh round of tea, and for a few minutes they sat in the simple contentment of warmth shared. The shop hummed softly with domestic sounds, a clock ticking the kettle's quiet breath, a faint creak as the shelves settled into their own age. Then, as if the world had decided that kindness should be rewarded with progress, Fagin reached for the mitten again. Now he said to our woolen friend, "Elspeth, my dear, before you go claiming it, let us make sure it truly belongs to you. Forgiveness is much improved by accuracy." Elspeth flushed, but nodded. "Of course." Fagin opened the cuff and turned the mitten inside, slightly peering at the stitching as a jeweler might. He made a thoughtful sound. He murmured. "The initials are neat, yes, but the darn look here. See this little patch near the thumb? A star stitch. That is not Elspeth Hardy's hand." Elspeth leaned forward. "It's not." "I've seen your mending," Fagin said kindly. "You do a tidy ladder stitch." "Sensible. This one's fanciful, someone with a poetic needle." Elspeth's mouth parted. For a moment, she looked as though she might crumble into embarrassment. But Oliver reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, lightly, as if to say, "We are all allowed to be wrong." And besides, Fagin added, as though remembering something obvious, "Elspeth, do you not keep your own mittens in your basket at the gatehouse?" Elspeth stared, then drew her brows together. "I do," she admitted, and her eyes widened. "Oh." The Dodger tilted his head. "Meaning?" Elspeth swallowed. "Meaning my mitten might have been there all along." Fagin rose and went to a low shelf near the door, where visitors often left bundles. From it, he lifted a plain basket, the sort Elspeth carried set there earlier when they came in. He brought it to the table and with a gentle ceremony folded back the cloth. There within lay another mitten, its twin safe and undisturbed. Elspeth made a small sound that was half laugh and half sigh. "Oh," she whispered again. Then, as if the admission had been waiting behind her ribs, she covered her face with her hands. "I took it upon myself. I made a fuss. You were worried," Oliver said softly. "And then you were relieved. That's all." Elspeth lowered her hands. Her eyes were damp, but her expression was not ashamed, so much as tenderly astonished. Astonished that she could be mistaken and still be held with kindness. "I'm sorry," she said to Eleanor, voice small. "You went out of your way for me, and it wasn't even mine." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest, something that looked very much like the very forgiveness she had just spoken aloud. "It was not wasted," Eleanor said. "Not if it helped you breathe again." Elspeth blinked hard and nodded. The Dodger tried to lighten the moment, as was his way. "Well," he declared, "that's Southwark for you. You go hunting a mitten, and you end up finding your own feelings in a basket." Fagin chuckled. "Indeed, but now we have a mitten that truly is lost." He lifted it again as though it were a small creature needing guidance, and we must return it to its true owner. Before the worry settles in, as our conscientious Eleanor prefers. Eleanor straightened a little. There it was, the errand renewed, not with frustration, but with a calm clarity. But who? Eleanor asked quietly. The initials. E. H. Fagin murmured, and his gaze drifted not to them, but to a shelf near the stove. There, propped in a small wooden stand, was an old shop ledger, thick worn and tied with a ribbon. Fagin rose, fetched it, and laid it on the table with a thump so gentle it felt like a pillow. My ledger, he said, patting it fondly. Some men keep accounts of money. I keep accounts of lost and found. You'd be astonished what folk bring me. Not because I'm some grand authority, no. Only because my shop is warm and my kettle is faithful. He untied the ribbon and opened the book. The pages were covered in a careful hand, each entry dated and described with affectionate detail. Lost one brass button shaped like a fish. Found beneath the steps of St. Swithin's. Lost a child's ribbon blue as summer. Found in a pocket of a borrowed coat. Lost a small courage last seen near the river. Found, returned by tea and conversation. Eleanor's lips parted in a smile at that last, though she did not know if it was joke or truth. Fagin flipped pages until he reached one near the end. He ran a finger down the entries, then stopped. Uh-huh, he said softly. Oliver leaned in, eyes curious. What is it? Elspeth asked, voice tentative, as if afraid of being wrong again. Fagin tapped the page. Here, he said, this very afternoon. A visitor came in quiet, wrapped up in a shawl, as if she were hiding from the season. She warmed her hands by the stove, drank her tea slow, and spoke with me about buttons. Buttons. As if buttons were the key to life, which in fairness they often are. The Dodger grinned. And was she pretty? Fagin gave him a look of theatrical reproach. Dodger, my boy, I am speaking of a person's worry, not your imagination. Now, her name, she told me, was Miss Edith Harrow. Eleanor's heart gave a small jump. Edith Harrow, she repeated. Fagin nodded. E.H. And she wore mittens, mismatched ones, it struck me, as if one had been replaced by something borrowed. She mentioned lodging in Southwark, in a boarding house with a narrow stairwell that smells of lavender and coal. Eleanor's breath caught. Mrs. Bellings, she whispered, surprised at the certainty. Precisely, Fagin said, eyes bright. And she was fretting about what was it? A small misunderstanding. She had spoken sharply to someone by mistake, and then regretted it. She said she wished she could begin again, but didn't know how to do it without seeming foolish. Eleanor's fingers curled around her cup. A lodger, then a quiet one, perhaps recently arrived. Eleanor pictured the boarding house corridor, the worn banister, the muffled sounds behind doors. She had seen, just yesterday, a woman passing with a parcel head, lowered shawl drawn tight. Eleanor had stepped aside to let her through, and the woman had murmured something, perhaps not unkind, but not warm either. Eleanor had thought little of it then, only that some people carried their days heavily. Fagin turned the ledger slightly toward them. In the margin of the entry was a note Miss E. Harrow left behind a mitten check. She left it here, Oliver asked, gentle. No, Fagin said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. She left with her mittens on. But she did fuss with her reticule, and she dropped a little card. I gave it back to her. Still, perhaps in that fussing she lost one somewhere along the way. The Dodger leaned back, satisfied. There you go. Back to the boarding house, neat as a pin. Elspeth looked at Eleanor, apology and relief mingling. So it was meant to find you, she said softly. In a way, Eleanor swallowed. perhaps she admitted. And then, because honesty felt easier in this warm place, she added, I didn't know her name. But I think I've seen her. Oliver nodded. Then we should return it, he said, as if it were the simplest moral in the world. If she's carrying a regret, a lost mitten might feel like the final proof that she can't do anything right. Eleanor felt the truth of that so keenly, it almost made her smile. How quick the mind was to turn a small loss into a judgment. Fagin closed the ledger and tied it again, as though tidying away the evidence of their little case. We shall return it, he said. And perhaps while we're at it, we'll return something else too. A little ease, a little forgiveness. The Dodger hopped up first, restless in the way youth often is, even in cozy rooms. Right then, back through the fog. The lamps will be making halos like angels, and the puddles will be pretendin' they're oceans. I'll guide. I'm excellent at guidin'. Fagin lifted a hand. Not so fast. Tea first. He gestured toward the stove. Let the kettle do its work. No point rushing out with cold hands and warm intentions. He rose and fetched a small tin from a shelf. Biscuits plain and sturdy, the kind that tasted of flour and comfort. He set them on the table. Eleanor took one and held it a moment before biting, letting the simple sweetness settle her nerves. She glanced at Elspeth, who was already breathing more evenly, her shoulders lowering as if the admission of her mistake had freed her from carrying it. Oliver's gaze drifted around the shop, lingering on a tiny wooden horse, a spool of ribbon, a cracked music box. His face held a quiet wonder, as if he saw, in every mended thing, a promise that people too could be mended. Fagin watched them all, with the satisfied air of a man tending a hearth. You know, he said, it's curious how objects do this. They pull people together. A mitten slips from a hand, and suddenly, 4 souls are sitting at my table speaking of forgiveness. The Dodger waved a biscuit. If you ask me, it's the mitten what needed forgivin'. Wandering off like that. Eleanor's lips curved. Or perhaps it needed to remind someone they are not alone. Oliver looked at her, and his small smile seemed to agree. When the tea was finished and the biscuits reduced to crumbs, Fagin handed the mitten back to Eleanor with a little bow. Take it, Miss Strake, he said, and his tone held an affectionate respect. You began the errand. You should have the honor of ending it neatly. Eleanor accepted it carefully, as if it were now not only wool, but purpose. Fagin fetched a lantern, not strictly necessary, with gas lamps outside, but comforting all the same. He wrapped a scarf about his neck, more for ceremony than warmth, and ushered them to the door. Do you come with us? Eleanor asked, surprised. Fagin's eyes twinkled. To the threshold, at least, he said. A shopkeeper should see his guests safely launched into the night. Besides, I like to look at the fog now and then. Reminds me the world is larger than my shelves. They stepped outside. The cold met them again, but it felt less sharp after the stove's kindness. The fog was thicker, yes, but the gas lamps dotted it with steady gold. Somewhere nearby, the river breathed its damp, patient breath. Fagin stood at his doorway. Lantern raised his shop's warmth, spilling behind him like a bright seam. Go on, he said softly. Southwark will try to confuse you, but you've got Dawkins and his directions, and Oliver and his steady heart, and you, Miss Strake, your careful hands. You'll do it. Eleanor nodded, and something in her chest, quiet, firm, answered, I will. The Dodger took the lead as promised, stepping into the fog as though he owned it. Oliver walked close beside Eleanor, and Elspeth followed Mitten, now absent from her shawl. But warmth newly present in her face. As they moved away, Eleanor glanced back once. Fagin was still at the doorway, lantern held high, his figure framed by the glow of his shop. For a moment, he looked like the keeper of a small lighthouse in a sea of mist, an unlikely, gentle guardian of lost things and found comfort. Then, the fog folded around them again, and the street opened ahead, quiet, damp, and waiting, while Eleanor carried the mitten in her reticule like a small promise that could still be kept. The fog received them again, as though it had been waiting with a patient hand upon the latch. It was thicker now, but not unfriendly. It softened the sharp corners of the city and turned each gas lamp into a small, floating moon. The stones underfoot shone with damp, and the air carried that mingled scent of river breath and coal smoke that belonged to Southwark as surely as a name. The Dodger walked ahead with the assurance of someone who had made a lifelong study of puddles and corners. He kept them to the brighter patches of pavement, steering them away from the slickest stones with little flicks of his wrist, as if he were conducting an orchestra that consisted entirely of careful footsteps. "Mind that bit," he murmured, indicating a shallow pool that reflected the lamp above like a second sky. "That puddle's got ambition. Wants to be the Thames." Eleanor stepped around it, holding her reticule close. Inside the mitten rested like a small sleeping creature, and she felt strangely as though she were carrying not just wool, but someone's peace of mind. Oliver stayed near her shoulder. His presence was quiet, steady, like a candle set in a window, saying without words, "Here is light." Elspeth walked behind her basket in the crook of her arm, no longer hunched with worry, but still tender, as if she had only just remembered she was allowed to breathe. They passed shuttered shops and narrow alleys where the fog pooled like milk in a basin. A cat slipped across their path, silent as a thought. Somewhere, a watchman's call rose and fell muffled by the mist, and the sound did not feel lonely. It felt like part of the city's lullaby. Eleanor found herself thinking of Mrs. Belling's remark, "Share them with the night," and she wondered, walking through this softened world, whether kindness was much the same. A person could count it, yes, one small act, one returned mitten, but in the end, it was meant to be given away again and again, until the night itself seemed warmer for it. They rounded a corner where a lamplighter had passed earlier. The lamp's glass was newly cleaned, and the flame inside burned with a neat, bright steadiness. The Dodger paused beneath it and tilted his head up, squinting, as though reading a message in the light. "That one," he said with grave approval, "is doing its job. Some lamps hiss like they're offended. That one's just being polite." Oliver smiled, and the smile looked like relief. Eleanor's boarding house emerged out of the fog as if drawn by the lamp's glow. Its railings slick with damp, its windows dim with the modest, cozy light of settled evenings. The front step was worn in the center, as though many cautious feet had climbed it, hoping to arrive somewhere safe. Eleanor's heart gave a small flutter as they approached. She was not ashamed of her lodging, but she was suddenly aware of how small it was, how ordinary. Yet perhaps ordinary places were precisely where forgiveness liked to live quietly, without a fuss, behind plain doors. The Dodger stopped at the gate and gave a little flourish. "Home base," he announced. "Right. Now, we knock like respectable folk we do." Eleanor reached for the latch, but before she could lift it, the door opened from within. Mrs. Belling stood there in her rolled sleeves, candle in hand, her face lit from below in a way that would have been eerie in another context, but was on her simply practical. Behind her, warmth spilled into the hall, the smell of toasted bread and soap and banked coals. Mrs. Belling's eyes narrowed at the sight of Eleanor, accompanied by a boy in a cap. Another boy, with gentle eyes, and Elspeth with her basket. Eleanor felt herself stiffen, then reminded herself, calm, conscientious, no fuss. "Good evening, Mrs. Belling," she said. Geese." Mrs. Belling's gaze slid to the Dodger. "Jack Dawkins," she said, with the weary familiarity of someone who had known him in passing for a long time. "You're like fog. You turn up where you please." The Dodger placed a hand on his chest. "Mrs. Belling," he said, as though greeting nobility, "you wound me. I turn up only where I'm needed, and where there's warmth." Mrs. Belling returned. Then her eyes moved to Oliver, and her expression softened at once. "Oliver," she said gentler, "come in, love. You'll catch your death in that damp." Oliver shook his head politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Belling. We won't stay long. We've come to return something." Mrs. Belling lifted her candle a touch. "Returned." In this house, she gave a brisk sniff. "Miracles do happen." Eleanor drew the mitten from her reticule and held it up. The wool looked darker in the candlelight, its careful stitching more intimate. Mrs. Belling's eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be," she said. "That belongs to Miss Harrow, it does. She's been pacing like a clock with legs, fretting over that mitten as though it were her last friend." Eleanor's breath eased. "She is here, then?" "Oh, she's here," Mrs. Belling said, and stepped back to allow them in. "Third room on the left up the stairs. And mind your boots. I scrubbed that landing this morning, and the fog's got no respect for effort." They entered the hall, and the change from outside to inside was like stepping into a different season. The air was warmer, thicker with domestic comfort. The candle's flame wavered gently, as if pleased. The stairwell rose ahead, narrow and familiar. Eleanor felt a private tenderness for it. The worn banister, the faint scent of lavender, the soft hush that lived in the corners. Tonight, it seemed warmer than usual, as though the hearths above had leaned closer, sharing their coals. As they climbed, Eleanor heard a soft, distant clink, someone setting down a spoon perhaps. A quiet cough behind a door. A faint murmur of conversation. The house felt alive in its restful way, like a sleeping cat that still hears every sound. Oliver's hand brushed the banister, and he smiled faintly. "It's warm here," he murmured. "It tries," Eleanor said, and felt absurdly proud of the old house. On the first landing, Mrs. Belling paused, holding her candle up toward a framed print that hung there. Eleanor had always liked the print because it showed St. Paul's in mist, and tonight, with the fog outside and the candle's glow, it looked almost real, as though the picture itself were another window. Mrs. Belling sniffed again, not unkindly. "Miss Harrow's a quiet one," she said. "Keeps to herself, pays on time. But she's got that look like she's always apologizing to the air." Eleanor swallowed, feeling the mitten warm in her palm, as if it had absorbed the house's heat. "Perhaps she's had a difficult time. Haven't we all?" Mrs. Belling replied briskly. "Still folk deserve a rest from their own thoughts now and then. Knock soft." She startles. They continued up to the next landing. The stairwell there was warmed by the nearby parlor hearth. A faint orange glow crept under the parlor door like a cat's tail. Eleanor could smell tea and something sweet, perhaps a pudding, left to cool. Mrs. Belling set down her candle on a small shelf and rubbed her hands on her apron. "Right," she whispered and pointed. "That door. third on the left. Eleanor's heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the strange intimacy of returning something lost. It felt like stepping into someone else's private weather. She approached the door and lifted her hand. The knock she gave was gentle, the way one might tap a sleeping child's shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing but the hush of the house. Then came a soft rustle fabric, perhaps, and a cautious voice. Yes. Eleanor leaned slightly toward the door. Miss Harrow, forgive me. I am Eleanor Strake. I live downstairs. I believe I have found something of yours. A pause, as if the words were being weighed. Then the door opened a small crack, and a woman's face appeared in the gap, pale in the lamplight, hair pinned neatly, eyes wide with the kind of worry that makes a person look younger than their years. Found, Miss Harrow repeated, and her voice trembled faintly. What have you found? Eleanor lifted the mitten into view. The woman's eyes filled at once, as if the sight of the wool had unknotted something inside her. Oh, she whispered. And then with a suddenness that was still gentle, she opened the door fully. Miss Edith Harrow stood there in a plain dress and shawl, her hands bare, and slightly reddened from cold. In the room behind her, Eleanor glimpsed a small fire in the grate, low but steady, and a chair drawn close to it. A teacup sat on a little table beside a book, and a single candle burned with careful economy. You found it, Edith said again, and the words sounded like gratitude and disbelief all at once. I found it beneath the gas lamp outside, Eleanor said, offering it forward, the initials E.H. I hoped I might return it before you worried. Edith took it as though she feared it might vanish if she did not hold it properly. Her fingers tightened around the cuff, and for a moment she simply looked down at it, breathing shallowly. Then she lifted her eyes to Eleanor, and to Oliver, and to the Dodger, and to Elspeth, who hovered behind with her basket. Edith began. Her throat bobbed. I don't understand. Why are there so many of you? The Dodger tipped his cap. Because he said grandly, a mitten don't travel alone. Not in Southwark. It collects folk, like a snowball, but warmer. Edith blinked, and a reluctant, startled laugh escaped her, small but real. The laugh seemed to loosen her shoulders. Oliver stepped forward, his voice soft. We met in the tea shop, he said, and at the chapel gatehouse, and then at Fagin's shop. Everyone wanted to help. At the mention of Fagin's shop, Edith's cheeks colored. Fagin? Yes, I went there earlier. Her gaze dropped to the mitten again. I suppose I was distracted. I've been distracted all day. Eleanor felt the moment hovering. This was the place where kindness could become something deeper if handled gently. She kept her voice calm. May we come in for a moment? She asked. Only a moment. It's warmer inside and the stairwell is drafty. Edith hesitated, her hand tightening on the mitten as though it were a decision. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Please, she said quietly. Yes, please come in. They entered in a small cluster, and Eleanor immediately felt the room's modest comfort wrap around them. Firelight, candlelight, the faint scent of tea. The room was not grand, but it was tidy, as though Edith had tried to make it a respectable refuge. A folded blanket lay on the bed. A pair of books were stacked neatly. On the mantel, a small dish held 2 buttons, one brass, one bone, like tiny talismans. Edith noticed Eleanor looking at them and flushed. Fagin gave those to me, she said, almost apologetically. He said sometimes a person needs something small to hold to remember they are not unraveling. Fagin's words echoed in Eleanor's mind. Small things are where the heart keeps its housekeeping. Oliver hovered near the fire, hands extended slightly toward the heat. Elspeth set her basket down carefully by the door. The Dodger, never still for long, wandered 2 steps and peered at Edith's bookshelf. "You've got poetry," he announced, astonished. "Proper poetry. This is a dangerous room." Edith's eyes widened. "Dangerous. Poetry makes you feel things," the Dodger said solemnly, as though warning her of a draft. "Next thing you know, you're staring at a lamp thinking about your childhood." "And Edith's laugh returned, a little steadier. "I suppose I already did that," she admitted. Eleanor moved closer to the hearth, not to crowd Edith, but to share the warmth. The fire made the room glow in a way that softened Edith's pallor, and Eleanor saw more clearly now how tired she looked. Not ill, not in danger, only worn thin by worry. Edith stood near the table, Mitten still in her hands, as if reluctant to let it go again. She took a breath. "Miss Strake?" she began, then stopped, as though the words that came next were difficult. Eleanor said gently. "Please." Edith nodded, swallowing. "Eleanor," she repeated, I owe you an apology." Eleanor's heart gave a small jump. She had not expected that, though perhaps she should have. Mrs. Belling had said Edith looked as though she was always apologizing to the air. Perhaps tonight she meant to apologize to something more solid. Edith looked down at the mitten, rubbing the stitched initials with her thumb. "When I came in yesterday, she said you stepped aside for me on the stairs. You were very polite. And she closed her eyes briefly. "I was curt. I think I even sounded ungrateful. It wasn't you. It was my own thoughts. I have been cross with myself for days, and when you offered me simple kindness, I didn't know how to take it without feeling ashamed." Eleanor felt her chest soften, as though a knot had been loosened without her having realized it was there. "I remember," Eleanor said quietly, "but I did not think much of it." Edith opened her eyes, and they shone. "I did. I thought of it all night. And then this morning, I told myself I would do better. I would smile. I would thank you. But when evening came, I grew frightened of appearing foolish, and I stayed in my room. And then—" She lifted the mitten slightly, as though it were proof. "Then I lost this, and it felt like the world confirming what I already feared, that I cannot set anything right." Oliver's face was so gentle it seemed almost luminous. "You can," he said simply. "You've begun already. You're apologizing now." Edith's breath shuddered. "Yes," she whispered, but Eleanor stepped a little closer, careful not to overwhelm. "Edith," she said softly, tasting the name as if it were a cup, set down with care. "I understand what it is to make one small mistake and think it means something about your whole nature. I have done that more than once." Edith stared at her, startled, as though she had expected Eleanor to be made of steadiness only. Eleanor continued, voice calm and true. "But tonight, a mitten was found. It traveled through warm places, the tea shop, the chapel light, Fagin's stove. It gathered people who wished you well even before they knew you. That does not feel like the world condemning you. It feels like the world making room for you." Edith's eyes brimmed, and she blinked quickly. "Why would anyone—" she began, and stopped, because her voice broke. The Dodger, leaning against the mantel, as if it were a stage, cleared his throat. His usual swagger had softened into something almost shy. Because he said you looked cold, that's all. And cold folks deserve warm things, even if they're a bit prickly at first. Edith's laugh and sob tangled together, and she pressed the mitten to her chest. Elspeth stepped forward, then basket in hand, her expression earnest. I thought the mitten was mine, she confessed, cheeks coloring. I was so sure. And when I realized it wasn't, I felt terribly foolish. But everyone was kind to me. Fagin said he said mistakes are just tiredness wearing a disguise. Edith looked at her, a faint smile, trembling at the corners of her mouth. That sounds like him, she murmured. Eleanor watched Edith's shoulders lower slowly, as if the room were allowing her to set down something heavy. Edith glanced toward the fire, then back to Eleanor. Would you sit? She asked, voice small. Just for a moment. I don't want the door to close again on this feeling. It's the first time in days I haven't felt like I'm standing outside my own life. Eleanor nodded and moved to the chair nearest the hearth, leaving space for Edith to choose her own place. Oliver sat on the edge of the second chair, hands folded. The Dodger remained standing, but closer now, as if he too wanted the warmth without admitting it. Elspeth perched on a stool near the door basket at her feet. Edith sat at last, drawing her chair nearer the fire with a soft scrape. The mitten lay in her lap like a settled worry. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire made small, contented sounds. The candle flickered. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the window pane, and the distant hiss of a street lamp drifted in like a reminder of the world beyond. Then Edith said very quietly, I wrote something today. Eleanor's gaze lifted. Did you? Edith nodded, and her fingers worried the edge of the mitten. A note, she said. Not to anyone in particular. At least I thought not. It was to myself, I suppose. An attempt to be kinder. I put it somewhere safe, and then I couldn't find it, and that made me feel even worse, as if even my own comfort could be misplaced. Eleanor felt a soft ripple of recognition. Notes, receipts, little papers that carried too much meaning. Oliver leaned forward. What did it say? He asked gently. Edith hesitated, then gave a tiny embarrassed smile. It said, Begin again. That is allowed. The sentence hung in the warm air like a blessing spoken over tea. Eleanor felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. Begin again? That is allowed? It was so simple, and yet it struck like a tender bell. The Dodger made a quiet sound that might have been a cough, might have been emotion disguised. That's sensible, he muttered. Edith looked down. It is sensible, she agreed. But when I couldn't find it, I thought perhaps it isn't true. Perhaps I only wrote it because I wanted it to be true. Eleanor's hand, almost without her permission, moved to her reticule. The mitten had been in it earlier. She remembered the weight, the softness, the careful cuff. A thought came, gentle, not jarring. She reached for the mitten in Edith's lap, but did not take it. She only touched the cuff lightly. May I? Eleanor asked. Edith nodded at once, trusting. Eleanor lifted the mitten and turned the cuff inward, peering as Fagin had. Her fingers found something tucked beneath the folded wool. Something thin, papery, pressed flat by warmth and time. She drew it out carefully. A small folded slip, creased twice. Edith's breath caught. No, she whispered. Eleanor unfolded it, slowly. The paper was plain, but the handwriting was neat. Careful, the hand of someone who wished to do things properly, even when her heart trembled. Begin again. That is allowed. Edith brought a hand to her mouth. For a moment, she could not speak. Then she gave a soft, disbelieving laugh, and tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. "It was in my mitten," she breathed, voice full of wonder and relief. I must have I must have tucked it there without thinking. I do that sometimes when I'm frightened. I hide things where they're closest to me." Oliver's smile was so tender, it seemed to warm the room further. "You found it," he said. "No," Edith whispered, looking at Eleanor and then at the others. "You all found it. You found it. And you brought it back to me." Eleanor handed the note to Edith, who held it as though it were something sacred and fragile. Her fingers smoothed the paper as if smoothing her own thoughts. Outside, the fog pressed softly at the window, but inside the room, the hearth glow held steady, and Edith's shoulders lowered fully at last, as though she had finally been forgiven, not by some stern authority, but by the kinder, truer part of herself. Edith held the little folded note in both hands, as if the paper were warm enough to thaw a part of her that had been chilled for far too long. The firelight gilded the edges of the words. The candle made the ink look softer, less like a command, and more like a promise. For a moment, she could do nothing but breathe slowly, deeply, until the tightness in her chest began to loosen. "I can't believe it," she whispered, not to anyone in particular. "It was with me the whole time." Eleanor watched Edith's fingers, smoothing the creases again and again, as though each pass of her thumb were an act of gentle repair. Eleanor understood the impulse. There were some things a person wished to mend, not because they were broken beyond use, but because they deserved to be treated kindly. Oliver's gaze remained on Edith's face with the steady patience of someone who had learned early that relief can be shy. Sometimes, he said softly, a person hides comfort without meaning to. Like putting a candle behind your back and then wondering why the room is dark. Edith gave a small, tearful laugh. That's exactly what it feels like. The Dodger, who had been leaning against the mantel, like a boy pretending he had no heart to speak of, cleared his throat again and shifted his weight. "Well," he declared, aiming for cheer, "if notes can hide in mittens, no wonder I can't find my other sock." Socks are full of secrets. Elspeth's lips twitched, and Edith's laugh came a little freer. Even Mrs. Belling's imagined snort seemed to echo in the stairwell beyond the door, as if the house itself approved of the joke. Edith looked from face to face, Eleanor Oliver, the Dodger Elspeth, and something in her expression softened into a kind of astonished gratitude, as though she had wandered into a room she hadn't known existed. "You all came," she said, "for a mitten, for me, and you didn't even know me." Eleanor sat with her hands resting on her knees, feeling the fire's warmth climb slowly into her sleeves. "We knew enough," Eleanor said. "We knew someone had dropped a mitten on a damp evening. That's enough to wish them well." Edith's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not look like panic. They looked like release, and Elspeth added earnestly, "We knew what it is to turn a small loss into a judgment of ourselves. I did it within the hour. I claimed the mitten as mine and made it into a sermon." Edith pressed the note gently to her chest, just beneath her collarbone. "I do that," she admitted. "Make sermons. Only the sermons are always against me." Oliver's voice was quiet, almost shy, but full of conviction. "Perhaps you might try making one for you instead. Just once. A small one." Edith swallowed. She glanced down at the paper again, then nodded slowly, as if testing the idea like a foot on a new stair. I wrote those words because I wanted them to be true, she said. And now they feel true. Eleanor felt a small warmth bloom behind her ribs, something not unlike pride. Though it was not pride in herself, so much as pride in the simple fact that the night could still be kind. Edith reached for the mitten and slid her hand into it, then the other, as though proving to herself that she was whole again. The wool hugged her fingers, and she flexed them slightly, surprised perhaps at the comfort of something so ordinary. "I'm sorry," she said again, looking at Eleanor. "About the stairs, about being sharp. I was sharp because I was frightened, and that is a poor excuse." Eleanor considered her and felt her own old anxious memory, the missing receipt, the raised eyebrows rise and then soften. She did not want to hold on to small hurts. That was the whole point of this errand, wasn't it? "It's all right," Eleanor said. "Truly." And if it helps, she hesitated, then allowed herself the honesty the warm room invited. "I've been frightened too. Not of you. Of doing things wrongly. Of misplacing what matters." Edith's gaze sharpened with gentle interest. "Have you?" Eleanor nodded. "I mislaid a receipt at work. Only for a short time. It was found. No disaster. But I carried the shame of it as though it had stained my character. I have been longing to do one small kindness neatly from beginning to end, to reassure myself I am not only my mistakes." Edith's expression softened. "Then you have," she said simply. "You did." Eleanor blinked, surprised at how much those words soothed. "You did." As if a kindness could in fact be completed. As if she could lay it down like a finished stitch. Oliver smiled faintly. The Dodger nodded with exaggerated solemnity, as though judging the completion of tasks were his appointed role. "Well," the Dodger said, "if we're confessing now, I'll confess something too." Elspeth looked at him with amused suspicion. "This should be good." The Dodger lifted a finger. "I'm hungry." Edith laughed, and this time it sounded like someone stepping out into sunlight. "I'm afraid I have very little," she said, then glanced toward a small tin on the shelf. "Actually, I have biscuits. Mrs. Belling insists every lodger should keep biscuits for emergencies." "Wise woman," the Dodger declared. "Biscuits are the foundation of civilization." Edith rose her movements, already less tense, and fetched the tin. She opened it and offered it around. The biscuits were plain, but they tasted of flour and comfort, and when Eleanor bit into one, she felt something in her chest settle further. How quickly the body trusted warmth and sweetness. How quickly the mind followed. They ate in companionable quiet for a few minutes, letting the fire do its patient work. Outside, the fog pressed softly to the window pane. The gas lamp in the street below hissed with steady devotion. The sound was like distant rain, like a whispering reassurance that the world continued calmly without demanding too much. Edith, seated again, looked down at her mittened hands. "I came to London," she said quietly, as if the sentence had been waiting. "Not for grand reasons, only because I thought if I changed my place, perhaps I could change my mind. I had been living with my aunt in a small town, and I was always being careful not to trouble her. I worried that I was too much and also not enough. So when a cousin wrote that there was a position, clerical work, very modest, I came." Eleanor listened, hearts tender. The story was simple, but it carried that familiar weight, the weight of wanting to be acceptable. "And when I arrived," Edith continued, "I meant to be brave. I meant to be agreeable. But I felt so very small among the noise and the streets and the fog. I thought everyone could see how uncertain I was, and when people were kind, it frightened me, because kindness feels like something I might ruin. Oliver's eyes shone. You won't, he said without hesitation. You didn't ruin it tonight. You're holding it. Edith's mouth trembled into a smile. Am I? Yes, Eleanor said softly. You are. The Dodger munched thoughtfully, then waved a biscuit. And if you do ruin something, he said, as if offering a practical solution, you come to Fagin's and he'll fix it. He fixes everything. He once fixed a teapot, what had a crack like the Thames at low tide. Edith laughed again, wiping her cheeks with the back of her mitten. I do like him, she admitted. He listened to me speak about buttons, which is not an interesting subject to most. Eleanor glanced at the mantel, where Edith's 2 buttons sat in their little dish like humble treasures. Buttons can be important, Eleanor said. They keep things together. Edith's eyes softened. That's what he said, she murmured. He said sometimes we come undone in small ways, and small things help us remember we can be fastened again. The fire popped gently, sending up a brief bright spark. It did not startle anyone. It only reminded them that warmth had its own quiet life. A small silence followed the comfortable kind, full not empty. Eleanor felt her breathing slow, and she noticed the simple details of the room. The book by Edith's teacup, its ribbon marker neatly tucked. The way the blanket on the bed was folded with careful corners. The soft sheen of the candle wax where it had pooled and cooled. Edith had been trying, Eleanor realized, to build herself a refuge, one small habit at a time. At last, Elspeth rose, glancing toward the door. It's late, she said gently. And you should rest, Edith. Real rest. Not the kind where you lie down and argue with yourself in the dark. Edith's cheeks colored. I do that, she confessed. We all do, Eleanor said. But perhaps tonight you'll do it less. Oliver stood too, and the Dodger, with exaggerated reluctance, followed suit. Edith rose, clutching the note again. Thank you, she said, voice thick with feeling. All of you. I don't know what to say. You can say good night, Oliver offered kindly. That's enough. Edith nodded, smiling through her lingering tears. Good night, she said. And thank you, Eleanor. Eleanor stepped closer, and on impulse took Edith's hand briefly. Just a light squeeze, mittened warmth against her fingers. You're home here, Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with the certainty. Even if it takes time to feel it. Edith's eyes closed for a moment, as if the words were a blanket settling. I want to believe that she whispered. You can begin again, Eleanor said, nodding toward the note. That is allowed. Edith laughed softly like a sigh that had become a smile. Yes, she said. Yes, it is. They left her, then closing the door gently, so the latch clicked with a comforting finality, not an ending, but a promise of privacy and rest. In the stairwell, the warmth felt even more noticeable, now seeping from the nearby hearths into the narrow space like kindness that had nowhere else to go. Mrs. Belling waited on the landing with her candle arms folded, eyebrows lifted in stern inquiry. Well, she demanded in a whisper that was only half-whisper. Did you return it? Did the mitten cause a riot? The Dodger's grin returned. No riots, he assured her. Only feelings. Mrs. Belling made a sound like a kettle starting. Feelings, she muttered. Always trouble. Still. Her gaze flicked to Eleanor's face, and something in it softened. She all right, Eleanor nodded. She will be. Mrs. Belling huffed, as though she disapproved of tenderness, but could not resist it. Good, she said briskly. Now, Oliver, you come downstairs a moment. I've got cocoa on the hob, and Jack Dawkins, if you nick my biscuits, I'll have your ears. I would never, the Dodger said, offended and delighted at once. They descended together to the parlor, where the hearth glowed, and the clock ticked steadily, marking time, as if time were simply another thing that could be made calm with warmth. The parlor smelled of banked coals and cocoa and old upholstery, a scent like winter evenings, even in spring. Mrs. Belling poured cocoa into mugs with the efficient grace of a woman who believed comfort should not be discussed, only delivered. She handed one to Oliver first, then to Eleanor, then grudgingly to the Dodger, as if to say, "Drink it, and don't make a poem about it." Elspeth accepted hers with both hands. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Mrs. Belling waved the gratitude away. "Cocoa isn't charity," she said. "It's sense. You come in from fog, and you warm the inside, or else the inside starts thinking it's fog, too." Eleanor took a sip. It was thick and sweet, the sort of drink that makes a person feel for a moment as if the world cannot possibly demand anything harsh while cocoa exists. They sat around the hearth in an easy cluster, Oliver on a footstool, Elspeth on the edge of a chair, the Dodger perched like a sparrow Eleanor in her usual spot by the arm of the sofa. Mrs. Belling stood for a moment, then, after pretending she had no time, took the chair nearest the fire. The flames made a slow dance of light across their faces. The fog outside pressed at the windows, but the curtains were drawn, and the room held its own weather, warm, steady, forgiving. Mrs. Belling sipped her cocoa and glanced at Eleanor over the rim of her mug. "So," she said gruffly, "you did your small kindness." Eleanor's? Yes. She did not know if she wanted to admit how much it mattered, but the hearth's warmth made honesty easier. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I did." Mrs. Belling nodded once, as if stamping a receipt. "Good." The Dodger leaned back and looked at the fire. "This is nice," he said, as though surprised to find himself in a parlor with cocoa and no one chasing him out. "You know, Mrs. Belling, sometimes you look like you don't like anybody, but then you feed us." Mrs. Belling's eyes narrowed. "Don't get sentimental, Jack Dawkins." "I'm not," the Dodger insisted. "I'm observin'. Observin's respectable." Oliver's mouth curved. "Mrs. Belling is kind," he said simply. Mrs. Belling made a small embarrassed sound and stared into the fire as though it had insulted her. "Mind your cocoa," she muttered. "It'll go cold." Elspeth, who had been quiet, spoke softly. "It's strange," she said, "how much lighter a worry feels when someone else holds it for a moment." Eleanor nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Belling's gaze stayed on the flames. After a pause, she said gruff and low, "Folk always think they've got to be tough to survive in London. But tough ain't the same as hard. You can be tough and still be soft inside, like a loaf with a crust." The Dodger's eyes widened. "Mrs. Belling," he whispered, "was that wisdom?" Mrs. Belling shot him a look. "Don't start." Eleanor felt warmth climb into her chest that had nothing to do with cocoa. The boarding house, its stairwell, its hearth, its quiet sounds was not grand, but it was a place where small kindnesses could happen without ceremony, where forgiveness might sit in an armchair and be handed a mug, whether it admitted it, needed one, or not. When the cocoa was finished, Oliver rose polite as ever. "I should go," he said softly. "Fagin will be expecting me." "I'll escort you," the Dodger said at once, eager to reclaim the street, though his voice carried a new softness. "Can't have you wandering into fog alone like a lost hymn." Elspeth stood too, gathering her basket. "I should return to the chapel gatehouse," she said, The lamp needs checking before morning. And I like knowing it's steady. Eleanor rose too, setting her empty mug down with care. She felt a gentle tiredness now, the good kind, the kind that follows warmth and resolved worry. Mrs. Belling waved a hand. Go on then, she said, and wipe your boots again on the way out. Fog's got no manners. They moved into the hall together. The front door opened, and the cool air brushed their cheeks. The fog had thinned a fraction, perhaps, or perhaps it only seemed thinner because Eleanor's mind was less crowded. On the step, Oliver turned to Eleanor. Thank you, he said quietly, for being kind. It makes places feel safer. Eleanor's throat tightened. Thank you, she replied, for being steady. Oliver smiled, and in that smile, Eleanor saw the quiet strength of someone who had suffered, yes, but had chosen gentleness anyway. The Dodger tipped his cap to Eleanor. Night, Miss Strake, he said, then corrected himself with a grin. Night, Eleanor. Don't go counting your coals too fierce. Remember, share 'em with the night. Eleanor laughed softly. I will. Elspeth touched Eleanor's hand briefly. Good night, she said, earnest. And thank you for helping me feel forgiven too. Eleanor squeezed her fingers. Good night. They stepped out into the fog, the gas lamp's hiss meeting them like a familiar friend. Oliver and the Dodger headed toward the glow of Fagin's shop, their figures quickly softened by mist. Elspeth turned toward the chapel, her basket swinging gently at her side, her pace calm and purposeful. Eleanor stood for a moment on the step, watching the lamplight make gold of the fog. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage wheel sighed on wet stone. The city was quiet, almost tender. Then Eleanor went back inside, closing the door gently against the damp. The warmth of the boarding house embraced her at once. She climbed the stairs, her hand sliding along the worn banister, feeling how familiar it was, how faithful. When she reached her own room, she paused, listening. In the corridor, all was hushed. But beneath that hush, the house lived coals, settling clocks ticking, a distant kettle cooling. It was the sound of a place that held people, imperfect people, and did not demand they be anything else. Eleanor entered her room, lit her candle, and sat for a moment by her small grate. The coals inside had shifted, but still glowed with quiet embers. She thought of the little coal beads at Fagin's table, of the words spoken over them. She thought of Edith's note tucked in a mitten like a secret prayer. Begin again. That is allowed. Eleanor let the sentence settle into her breathing. She removed her shawl, folded it neatly, and placed it on the chair. Then, as if tidying her room were a way of tidying her mind, she arranged her household book and set her pen straight. At last, she climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The candle's flame wavered softly as she blew it out, and darkness filled the room. Warm darkness, not empty. Outside, the gas lamp hissed. The fog drifted, and somewhere nearby, a hearth breathed its steady comfort into the night. Eleanor's eyes closed, and her last thought was not of mistakes nor of shame, but of a mitten under gaslight and the gentle truth that forgiveness can be found, returned and held so quietly, so kindly, that a person might begin again without fear. Morning came in the way it often does in Southwark, without fanfare, but with a kind of patient determination. The fog that had ruled the night did not vanish so much as thin, turning from a thick curtain into a pale veil. Daylight, cautious as a visitor in a new house, pressed its gray fingers to the window panes and waited to be invited in. Eleanor woke with the pleasant heaviness that follows true rest. For a moment, She lay still beneath the blankets listening. The boarding house had its morning music, a distant kettle beginning to sing, a door opening and closing, with careful restraint, the soft scuff of slippers on the landing. Somewhere below, Mrs. Belling's voice floated up mildly stern, as if scolding the day into behaving itself. Eleanor's mind, so quick to seize upon errors, offered her, instead, a quiet recollection of warmth, cocoa by the hearth. Edith's relieved laugh, the little note unfolded like a benediction. Begin again. That is allowed. It felt different in the daylight, less like a dramatic declaration, more like a simple instruction. A sensible person might pin above her mantle. Eleanor breathed it in as though it were steam from a cup. She dressed without hurry, washing in cool water that woke her skin gently and pinning her hair with the tidy care she gave to all small things. When she was ready, she took her empty cup and stepped into the corridor. The stairwell welcomed her with its familiar scent of lavender and coal. The banister was cool beneath her hand, smooth as old wisdom. As she descended, the warmth from the parlor hearth rose to meet her, and with it the smell of bread toast perhaps, or something closer to a bun. The boarding house did not offer luxuries, but it offered steadiness, and Eleanor found that steadiness was more nourishing than grandness. In the kitchen, Mrs. Belling stood, with her back to the fire, turning slices of bread with the same authority she applied to most things. A pot of tea sat on the hob breathing. The kettle, having done its singing, now simmered in contentment. Mrs. Belling glanced over her shoulder. "You're up," she said, as if this were evidence in a case. "Yes," Eleanor replied and set her cup down in the basin. Mrs. Belling huffed, but her eyes softened. "You sleep all right?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, better than I have in some time." Mrs. Belling gave a single brisk nod as though approving a signed form. "Good. Breakfast'll help." She shoved a plate toward Eleanor. Toast, scrape of butter, and one egg that looked as though it had been coaxed into being by sheer will. Eleanor's gratitude rose like warmth. "Thank you." "Eat," Mrs. Belling said, which was her version of kindness. As Eleanor took her first bite, she heard the soft sound of steps on the kitchen threshold. She looked up. Edith Harrow stood there, her hair pinned neatly, her face paler than Eleanor's, but not as drawn as it had been the night before. She held herself with the cautiousness of someone entering a room where she fears she has done wrong. Yet her hands were mittened now, both of them, and that small fact made her look steadier, as if the wool were not only warm, but armor. "Good morning," Edith said. Mrs. Belling lifted her chin, her manner brusque, but not unkind. "Morning? Tea's there. Cups clean. Don't stand in the doorway like a ghost." Edith blinked, then moved in obeying. Eleanor stood at once, though she did not know why. Only that she wished Edith to feel welcomed by something more than Mrs. Belling's practical orders. "Good morning," Eleanor said softly. Edith's eyes flicked to Eleanor's face, and a shy smile trembled there. "Good morning," she replied. And the words held something new, a willingness, perhaps, to be present. Mrs. Belling slapped another slice of bread into the pan with unnecessary force. "If you two are going to exchange greetings like you're posting letters, at least have some toast while you do it." Edith colored and moved toward the teapot. Her hands shook slightly as she poured, though she steadied them by setting the cup down and bracing it with her palm. Eleanor found herself speaking before she could talk herself out of it. "Would you sit?" she asked, gesturing to the small table by the kitchen hearth. "It's warmer there." Edith looked as though she might refuse out of habit. Then she glanced at her mittened hands, at the steam rising from her cup, and she nodded. They sat. The kitchen was bright with firelight, even in the morning. the coals glowing with quiet determination. The air smelled of tea and toast, and there was a comfort in its simplicity that made Eleanor's shoulders relax without her noticing. Edith held her cup as if it were a small animal she did not wish to frighten. "I slept," she said, almost surprised. "I thought I wouldn't. I thought my mind would chase itself again." Eleanor smiled gently. "Did it?" Edith shook her head. "Not much. I read a little, and then I put the note." She patted her reticule, and Eleanor glimpsed the edge of paper. "I put it where I could find it, and I told myself only once, begin again." Mrs. Belling made a noise somewhere between approval and disgust. "Talking to yourself is all right," she called over her shoulder, "as long as you don't answer back." Edith's smile grew a fraction. Eleanor felt a soft relief bloom. This was how home happened, not with grand declarations, with tea, with shared warmth, with small jokes that did not wound. Eleanor took a sip of her own tea and tasted something deeper than leaves gratitude, perhaps. Then, as if the day wished to tie up its gentle threads, she said, "I thought later when I go out, I might stop by Mrs. Plume's tea shop to thank her, and perhaps Fagin's shop as well. He was very kind." Edith's eyes lit with interest, then clouded with hesitation. "Fagin? Yes, I should like to thank him too, but I don't want to impose." Eleanor's voice remained calm. "It would not be imposing. It would be returning warmth the way we returned your mitten." Edith looked down at her cup. Would you mind if I came with you?" she asked quietly. Only if you don't mind." Eleanor felt that familiar longing in her chest. The longing to do one small kindness neatly done shift into something broader, gentler. She could do more than one kindness, perhaps. She could make a habit of it. "I'd like that," Eleanor said. Edith's breath eased. "Thank you." Mrs. Belling, still hovering in the background like a stern household spirit, muttered, "There. That's settled then. Now eat your toast before it turns into a plank." By midday, the fog had retreated into the edges of things. It lingered at the river's shoulder, curled in alleyways, and hovered at the corners like a shy cat. But the streets were brighter, and the gas lamps, though still lit in the dimness, looked less like moons and more like modest sentinels waiting for evening's return. Eleanor and Edith stepped out together, both properly wrapped, both with that particular carefulness of women who know how quickly damp can creep into a seam. Eleanor had her reticule. Edith carried a small paper parcel tied with string, a gift, she said, though she would not say what. They walked at an unhurried pace, letting the city move around them like slow water. Horse hooves made soft, regular sounds. A cart rattled by its wheels, squeaking in polite complaint. From a doorway, a woman shook a mat, and dust floated briefly in the air like a little gray cloud. Edith's gaze shifted from shop fronts to window panes, to the river beyond, as if she were trying to teach herself that she belonged among these moving parts. At times, she drew close to Eleanor, and Eleanor did not mind. It felt companionable, as if the day had placed them in the same sentence. "I used to think London would be harsher," Edith admitted softly as they passed beneath a gas lamp whose glass caught the daylight, "that the city would notice me and reject me." Eleanor glanced at her. "Does it feel that way now?" Edith considered. "No," she said. "It feels busy, but also full of rooms, full of places where warmth gathers, like pockets." Eleanor smiled. "Yes, pockets is a good word." Edith's mittened fingers touched her reticule where the folded note rested. And it is full of people who do not always behave as one expects, she added. A boy who jokes about puddles, another who speaks as though kindness is ordinary, a shopkeeper who keeps a ledger for lost courage. Eleanor chuckled softly. Yeah, Southwark has its surprises. They reached Mrs. Plume's tea shop just as the kettle inside began to hiss. The window was slightly fogged with warmth, and the bun cloth looked like a sleepy cap. As they entered, the bell gave its gentle tinkle. Mrs. Plume looked up at once, her face brightening with recognition. Well now, she exclaimed, if it isn't the Mitten Brigade! The Dodger was nowhere in sight, but his spirit seemed to hover in the corners, ready to make mischief out of tea. Eleanor smiled. Good day, Mrs. Plume. And good day to you, Mrs. Plume, replied, wiping her hands on her apron and coming around the counter as if to embrace the air around them. Her eyes flicked to Edith and softened. And you must be Miss Harrow. I heard tell you were fretful last night. Sit, love. Sit. Kettle's on and worries off. Edith colored, but her smile was real. Thank you, she said softly. I wanted to thank you for your help and for your tea. Mrs. Plume waved the thanks away. Tea helps itself, she said. It can't bear to be idle. And besides, the day you stop giving tea to folk, what need warming is the day the kettle sulks. Eleanor and Edith sat by the window seat, and within moments, cups were placed before them, steaming and fragrant. The warmth found their hands again, familiar as a refrain. Edith opened her parcel and produced a small packet of biscuits, plain but neatly wrapped. For you, she said shyly. It's not much. Mrs. Plume's eyes shone. Not much, she echoed. Miss a biscuit given kindly is a feast. Thank you. I'll set them by the kettle so they learn the right attitude. Edith laughed softly more easily now, and Eleanor felt something in her chest ease further. How quickly laughter could make a place feel safe. They stayed only a short time long enough to drink half their tea and feel warmth settle into their fingers, then rose to go. Mrs. Plume pressed another bun upon them, as if it were illegal to leave her shop empty-handed. For the road, she insisted, and tell Fagin I sent my regards. Tell him if he keeps encouraging confessions, I'll start charging him rent for all the feelings he borrows. Eleanor promised she would. Fagin's curiosity shop looked different in daylight. The windows still glittered with oddments, but the objects seemed less theatrical and more honest. In the morning light, brass was simply brass ribbon, simply ribbon. And yet there remained in each thing a suggestion of story. When Eleanor pushed the door open, the bells jingled as cheerfully as ever. Warmth rolled out to greet them, and the familiar scent tea, old wood cinnamon coal, wrapped itself around Edith's shoulders. She exhaled as though she had been holding her breath since stepping outside. Fagin appeared from behind a shelf, carrying a small tray of teacups, and when he saw them, his face brightened with true pleasure. Well, if it isn't my conscientious clerk and my mittened philosopher, he cried, setting the tray down with care. Come in, come in. Don't stand there as if the door might bite you. Edith smiled shyly. Good day, Mr. Fagin. Fagin, he corrected, waving away formality as though it were a draft. Good day, Miss Harrow. You look... He peered at her keenly. You look as though you slept. Edith's cheeks colored. I did, she admitted, and I came to thank you for listening and for making me feel less foolish. Fagin's eyes softened. Foolish, he echoed. My dear, foolishness is the most human of garments. We all wear it. Some wear it inside out, that's all. Edith laughed. and the laugh sounded warmer than the stove. Eleanor glanced around. "Is Oliver here?" she asked. "At the back, with a book," Fagin said, pointing. "He's teaching a stubborn clock to be more punctual through sheer kindness." And Dawkins swept my floor and complained the whole time that sweeping is an insult to art. As if summoned by his name, the Dodger's voice called from behind a curtain of hanging scarves. "I never said insult. I said it was suspiciously tidy work." He emerged with a small broom in hand, his cap pushed back, his grin bright. "Eleanor," he cried, "and Miss Harrow, look at you both vertical and respectable in daylight." Edith laughed, startled into it. "Good day, Jack Dawkins. See," he announced to no one delighted. She said my full name. "I'm practically a gentleman now." Oliver appeared from the back, book in hand, his gentle face brightening when he saw them. "Good day," he said softly. "I'm glad you came." Edith's gaze softened. "Good day, Oliver," she replied, "and thank you." Oliver looked slightly embarrassed by gratitude, as if he did not know where to put it. "You're very welcome," he said, and then, after a pause, added, "Are you feeling better?" Edith's mittened hands tightened slightly, then relaxed. "Yes," she said, "I feel as though I have been allowed to come inside." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, and she knew precisely what Edith meant. Inside the warmth, inside the day, inside one's own life. Fagin clapped his hands once softly. Then he declared, "We must mark the occasion properly. Tea for everyone." And perhaps his eyes twinkled one more coal, if we've got anything left to forgive. The Dodger groaned theatrically. "Not more feelings." "Oh, hush!" Fagin scolded him affectionately. "You have feelings like pockets full when you're not looking." They gathered again, around the little stove, cups in hand. The shop hummed in the background, with small, comforting noises, the kettle's gentle breath, a clock's steady ticking, the faint creak of shelves content with their burdens. Edith drew out her small note, the one that had been hidden in her mitten, and held it between her fingers. "I thought," she said shyly, "that I might leave this here." Fagin's eyebrows rose. "Leave it why?" "So someone else might find it," Edith said, voice soft but steady. "Not hidden in a mitten properly, where it can be seen. If someone comes in worried, they might read it, and perhaps it will help them." Eleanor felt a quiet swell of admiration. Edith was turning her fear into warmth, the way a hearth turns coal into light. Fagin's eyes glistened. He took the note with careful hands. "My dear," he said softly, "that is a very fine thing. We shall give it a place of honor." He rose and carried the note to a little frame that stood near the kettle, an empty frame that had once held a print now waiting for something worthy. He slid the note behind the glass so the words could be read and set it back where steam would not curl the paper. "Begin again, that is allowed." The sentence looked perfectly at home among the curios, as if it were an object that had always belonged to the shop. Oliver smiled, and Eleanor saw quiet pride in him. The Dodger pretended to sniff, as if the air had become too sentimental. Elspeth was not there today. She would be at the chapel, tending the gatehouse lamp. But Eleanor imagined her alcove, the steady gaslight, the basket of cloths. She imagined the lamp's flame calm and faithful, burning through day's gray and evening's fog alike. Fagin poured another round of tea, and the day settled into a gentle rhythm. Warmth passed from cup to hand, from word to ear. The world outside might still be damp and uncertain, but here, in lamplight and hearth glow, things were being set right in the smallest ways. After a while, Eleanor rose, sensing the moment's fullness. "We should go," she said softly. "There is work." and the day will not wait. Fagin made a dramatic sigh. The day is always interrupting my best conversations, he lamented. Go on then. But remember, my door is not only for lost objects, it is for lost calm, too. Edith nodded, her expression bright with sincere gratitude. I'll remember, she promised. Oliver walked them to the door, as if escorting them out were another form of kindness. The Dodger tipped his cap again, and this time he did it with genuine See you, Eleanor, he said. And you too, Miss Harrow. Don't let the fog bully you. Fog's all show. Edith smiled. I won't, she said, and there was a quiet certainty in it. Eleanor and Edith stepped back into the street. The afternoon had softened, and the fog had begun slowly to gather its skirts for evening. Gas lamps glimmered faintly, preparing their halos. Somewhere far off, a bell chimed the hour with unhurried grace. They walked back toward the boarding house. Shoulders relaxed, breath easy. Eleanor felt a gentle tiredness, not the anxious tiredness of worry, but the sweet tiredness of a day that has been lived kindly. And as the light began to fade and the first lamps hissed into full glow, the city seemed to gather itself into the same quiet mood as the night before. Fog, gaslight, hearth warmth behind curtained windows. Only now, Eleanor carried no urgent longing to prove herself. Only a calm, steady knowledge. Begin again, that is allowed. The afternoon, having carried them gently back toward the boarding house, did not hurry away. It lingered in the pale light upon the cobbles and in the softened outlines of carts and passers-by. Even the river seemed to breathe more slowly, as if it too had decided to take the day in a calmer fashion. Eleanor and Edith walked side by side, their steps falling into an easy rhythm that needed no conversation to keep it steady. When they did speak, it was in small, unforced remarks about a shop window that displayed bowls of bright apples, about the smell of fresh bread drifting from a baker's door, about how the fog, though persistent, had a habit of making every gas lamp look like a promise. At the boarding house gate, Edith paused with her hand on the latch, glancing up at the familiar windows. I used to think, she said quietly, that a place like this was only a stop, a temporary arrangement, a place where one waits until something better comes. Eleanor watched her profile, calm, thoughtful, less guarded now. And now Edith's mittened fingers curled gently around the iron. Now, I think it might be a beginning. Not grand, just a start. Eleanor felt warmth in her chest, deep and steady. Beginnings are often like that, she said. They don't announce themselves. They just open a door. They went in together, and the boarding house embraced them with its familiar warmth. The stairwell smelled faintly of lavender again, and the banister received Eleanor's hand like an old acquaintance. Somewhere upstairs, a kettle hissed. Somewhere below, a coal settled with a soft, satisfied click. Edith stopped at the foot of the stairs. I should go, she said, almost regretful. I must write to my cousin. She will worry if I don't. And I must. She hesitated, cheeks coloring. I must practice being ordinary, doing ordinary things without making them into moral trials. Eleanor smiled. That sounds like excellent practice. Edith nodded. Thank you, Eleanor. She glanced upward, then back again. Will you take tea with me later if you are not too tired? Eleanor felt the small kindness she had once longed to complete unfold into a new shape ongoing, shared not a single neat stitch, but a line of them steady and warm. I would like that, she said. Edith's smile lingered like candlelight. Good. Then gathering courage the way one gathers a shawl, she added, and perhaps we might invite Oliver too. And Jack Dawkins if he can behave himself. Eleanor's laugh was soft. We can try, she agreed. And Fagin, perhaps if he will leave his kettle for a moment. Edith's eyes brightened with something like hope. Yes, she whispered. Yes, we can try. They parted on the landing. Edith turning toward her room, Eleanor toward her own to gather the things she needed for work. There was still time before she must leave, and she used it in the way she used all time, quietly, carefully, making small order in her small space. She folded her shawl, checked her household book, set her pen straight. Then she paused, looking at the grate. The coals were fewer now. Enough certainly, but not abundant. Mrs. Belling's voice returned in her mind, share them with the night. Eleanor found herself smiling at the thought, and in an impulse of gentle generosity, she added one more small shovel of coal, not because she needed it, but because the warmth felt like something worth keeping alive. Outside, the day leaned slowly toward evening. The fog, which had been resting in corners and at the river's edge, began to gather again, drifting back into the streets as naturally as a cat returning to its favorite chair. Gas lamps hissed into fuller glow, and their halos began to bloom. Eleanor went out with her work satchel tucked close and her collar turned up against the damp. As she walked, the city's usual bustle brushed past her, softened by mist. There were voices and footfalls and the distant rattle of wheels, but nothing sharp. Even the busiest streets seemed muffled, as though London itself had wrapped a scarf around its throat. At the counting house, the air smelled of ink and paper and the particular dryness of ledgers kept in careful stacks. Eleanor took her place at her desk, smoothed the papers before her, and began her work. Ordinarily, work could be a place where her mind tightened, where each blot of ink felt like an accusation. But today, something had shifted. Perhaps it was the memory of Edith's note framed near Fagin's kettle, like a small blessing. Perhaps it was the quiet truth spoken over coal beads, I forgive myself. Perhaps it was simply that Eleanor had slept and rest makes kindness easier. When her superior passed her desk and paused, Eleanor felt her shoulders begin to rise of their own accord. She gently reminded them to lower. The man glanced at her figures, then at her handwriting. Very neat, Miss Strake, he said, as if surprised to find himself offering praise. Eleanor blinked. Praise was so rare in the counting house, it felt almost like hearing a bird sing indoors. Thank you, sir, she replied softly. He moved on without fuss, and Eleanor returned to her work with a steadier breath. Neatness, she thought, could be its own quiet kindness, not only toward others, but toward oneself. A small way of saying, I'm here. I am doing my best. That is allowed. The hours passed. Papers were tallied accounts, balanced ink dried. Outside, the fog thickened, and the gas lamps became brighter. Their steady, hissing, audible even through the closed windows when the street fell briefly quiet. When Eleanor's work was done, she gathered her things and stepped back into the evening. The air met her with cool dampness, but she did not resent it. She drew her shawl close and walked home as the city glimmered around her. Fog turned gold, cobbles turned dark, and shining windows turned into warm squares of hearthlight. Halfway along her route, she passed the small chapel. The gatehouse alcove was already lit, the gas lamp there steady and calm, as always. Elspeth Hardy stood beneath its basket at her side, lifting her face to check the flame with the seriousness of a person tending something sacred. Eleanor paused, her steps slowing. Elspeth, she called softly, not wishing to startle the quiet. Elspeth turned and smiled, genuine and bright. Eleanor, she said, "Good evening. How are you?" "Well," Eleanor replied. "And you?" Elspeth glanced up at the lamp again, then down. "Better," she admitted. "After last night, I told myself I would not scold my own mind for slipping. So when I nearly left the chapel key in the wrong pocket today, I simply laughed. Imagine. I laughed." Eleanor smiled. "That sounds like progress." Elspeth's cheeks warmed. "It is strange, isn't it, how quickly shame takes up residence, and how kindness, once you let it in, makes it pack its bags." Eleanor looked at the steady lamp, its glow falling like a small pool of safety. "This light helps," she said quietly. Elspeth nodded. "I think so too. When I stand here in the fog, I feel as though I am holding a little piece of steadiness for anyone passing by. Not because I am important, only because the lamp is, and I am its attendant." She glanced toward the chapel gate. "Are you coming to evening service?" Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, but I'm meeting Edith Harrow for tea." Elspeth's eyes softened. "The lodger," she said. "How is she?" "Better," Eleanor said. "We went to Mrs. Plume's and to Fagin's. She left her note there framed by the kettle." Elspeth smiled, visibly moved. "Oh," she murmured, "that's lovely." The fog drifted past them in slow ribbons. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour, muted by mist. Eleanor's breath made a pale cloud, then vanished. Elspeth, Eleanor said, after a moment, "Thank you for being honest last night. It helped more than you know." Elspeth's expression grew earnest. "Thank you," she replied, "for not making me feel foolish when I was wrong." Eleanor glanced at the lamp again. "Perhaps that is what forgiveness is," she said softly. "Not being made to feel foolish for being human." Elspeth nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I think so." They parted with a quiet good evening. Elspeth returning to her lamp. Eleanor continuing through the fog toward the boarding house. As she walked, she felt the city around her like a living thing, quietly breathing, quietly holding its lamps up against the mist, quietly offering warmth behind windows without asking who deserved it. At the boarding house, Mrs. Belling's voice floated from the kitchen as Eleanor entered. "Wipe your boots," she called before Eleanor had even closed the door. "Fog's got no manners, and I refuse to let it make a mess of my floors." Eleanor smiled, wiped her boots, and climbed the stairs. The stairwell was warmer now. The hearths above had been coaxed into bright life, and the heat crept into the narrow space like a friendly cat. Edith's door stood ajar, a line of firelight spilling into the corridor. Eleanor knocked lightly and heard Edith's voice calmer than the day before. "Come in." Edith's room was much the same as it had been, small, tidy, candle burning, but something in it felt different. The chair by the fire was pulled closer. The teacup was ready. On the mantel, beside the two buttons, Edith had placed a small sprig of greenery, perhaps taken from a market stall, as though she wished to remind the room that spring existed. Edith stood by the table kettle, steaming her mittens set neatly beside it, as if they were guests. She smiled when she saw Eleanor. "You're home," she said, and the words sounded like a small celebration. Eleanor removed her shawl and hung it carefully. "I am." "And you?" Edith nodded. "I wrote to my cousin," she said. "I didn't make it into a confession. I simply told her I was settling, that I had met kind people, that I was learning to sleep." Eleanor's chest warmed. "That's wonderful." Edith poured tea into 2 cups, her hands steadier now. And I did something else, she added, hesitating slightly. What? Eleanor asked, curious. Edith reached into her reticule and drew out a small card folded. She offered it to Eleanor with a shy expression. I made this, Edith said, for you. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. Inside, in Edith's neat handwriting, were words, simple enough to feel like truth. Thank you for returning what was lost, and for helping me return to myself. Eleanor's eyes stung. She swallowed, touched. Edith? Edith's cheeks colored. It isn't much, she said quickly. But I wanted, after last night, I wanted to finish something neatly, too. Not because I had to, because I wished to. Eleanor held the card, as though it were a small warmth she could keep. It is more than enough, she said softly. Thank you. They sat by the fire with their tea, and the room settled around them. The fog outside pressed gently at the window, blurring the street lamp into a halo. The hiss of gaslight was faint, like a lullaby. The fire cracked softly, and the coals shifted with that quiet ticking sound that made time feel less sharp. For a while, they spoke in low voices about small things. About how Mrs. Belling's toast always tasted of stubbornness. About how the tea shop smelled like comfort itself. About the curiosity, shop's strange objects, and the way Fagin looked at each one as if it were a person with feelings. At one point, Edith confessed with a shy smile, I used to think I must never inconvenience anyone. That, to be loved, one must be invisible. Eleanor's gaze softened, and now Edith looked at her cup, watching the steam curl. Now, I think, she said slowly, that invisibility is not love. It is loneliness. Eleanor nodded, feeling the truth settle in her bones. Yes, she murmured. A knock sounded at the door. Light and brisk. Edith startled slightly, then laughed at herself and called, Yes. The door opened, and Oliver stood there, cap in hand, his expression gentle and a little shy. Good evening, he said. Mrs. Belling said I might come up. She said you were having tea and that the stairwell was warm enough to allow company. Edith laughed softly. Mrs. Belling says such things, Oliver smiled. Only when she means them. Behind him, as if he had been waiting to be dramatic, the Dodger leaned into view. And she said, he added that if we bring the fog in, she'll feed us to it. Edith's smile widened. Come in, she said, and there was real welcome in it now. Please. They gathered in the small room, four souls again drawn together by warmth and quiet honesty. Oliver took the chair nearest the fire, hands outstretched to the heat. The Dodger perched on the edge of the bed, as though chairs were too ordinary for him, and immediately began to comment on Edith's sprig of greenery. Look at that, he said approvingly. Spring's moved in. Next you'll be hanging bird cages and talking to canaries. It's only a sprig, Edith protested, laughing. A sprig's how it starts, the Dodger warned. Plants are persuasive. They'll have you believin' in tomorrow. Oliver looked at Edith with warm seriousness. Believing in tomorrow is a good thing, he said. Edith's smile softened. Yes, she said quietly. I think it is. Eleanor poured another cup of tea and handed it to Oliver. Edith offered biscuits. Mrs. Plume's bun, now cut carefully into 4 pieces so no one felt greedy. The small room became for that hour a kind of hearth, on its own cozy safe, filled with gentle sounds and softer breathing. At some point, the conversation drifted back to forgiveness, as if forgiveness were a cat that always found the warmest chair. I used to think forgiveness was something other people gave you, Edith said softly, staring into the fire. Like a coin, like permission. Eleanor nodded. But last night, Edith continued when the mitten came back, and the note when I realized I had hidden comfort in my own hand. It felt like forgiveness was something I could offer myself. Not because I deserved it by being perfect, because I needed it in order to live. Oliver's eyes shone and he nodded slowly. Yes, he said, that's what I think too. The Dodger quieter, now fiddled with a loose thread on his sleeve. And if you can forgive yourself, he muttered, then maybe you can forgive the fog for being everywhere. Edith laughed softly, perhaps. Eleanor watched the fire and felt her own mind, usually so sharp with judgment, soften again. The warmth, the tea, the steady presence of these companions, all of it made her feel as though the world was not something she had to earn her way into. It was something she could simply inhabit one gentle moment at a time. Eventually, the hour grew later and the room grew quieter. Oliver's eyelids drooped slightly. His face relaxed. Edith's shoulders softened. Even the Dodger's restless energy slowed as if the fire had soothed the quickness out of him for a little while. Outside, the fog thickened again. The gas lamp hissed steadily, and somewhere in the boarding house, a clock ticked its patient rhythm. The night was settling in, and with it, the feeling that all was well enough. Eleanor looked around the room, at Edith holding her teacup with calm hands, at Oliver's gentle profile, in the firelight, at the Dodger's cap, now held loosely in his lap, and she felt very quietly that her small longing had been answered. Not by one single act neatly done, though that had been part of it, but by the discovery that kindness once begun could become a hearth others warmed their hands by, and that in the glow of it, forgiveness felt not like a grand ceremony, but like a simple, steady light. For a little while they sat as if the room itself had become a small harbor. 4 cups, a modest fire, and the hush of a house that knew how to keep the world's sharper edges outside the door. The bun had been shared into neat portions. The biscuits had dwindled to crumbs. The kettle, having performed its duty, settled into a gentle simmer that sounded like a contented purr. Edith's sprig of greenery on the mantel caught the firelight and looked almost brave, so small a thing to insist upon spring. And yet it did. Eleanor found herself watching it now and then, feeling as though the green were speaking a quiet lesson: you need not be grand to be alive. You need only persist. The Dodger, who could never entirely bear a silence without poking it, leaned forward on the bed and lowered his voice as if about to deliver a secret. You know what I reckon, he said. Oliver's eyelids were heavy, but he lifted them politely. What? I reckon the Dodger whispered that the fog listens. Proper listens. That's why it's always hanging about, so it can hear what folk are thinking. Edith's smile widened. If it does, it must be very tired. It is, the Dodger said, nodding gravely. That's why it's always laying down. Eleanor laughed softly, and the laugh seemed to ease something in her chest, as if humor were another sort of warmth. Outside the window, the gas lamp's hiss remained steady, and the fog pressed its pale face to the pane like a curious neighbor. If it was listening, Eleanor thought perhaps it would carry their gentle words through the streets and lay them down like blankets where they were needed. Edith leaned back in her chair, shoulders loosening. When I was a child, she said, surprising herself with the confession I used to lose gloves, one after another. My aunt would scold me, and I would feel as though I had done something terrible, something unforgivable. It's odd, isn't it, that such small things can teach you shame? Eleanor nodded slowly. Small things are how the mind practices, she said. It practices being harsh. or it practices being kind. Oliver's voice was drowsy, but sincere. I like kindness better, he murmured. So do I, Edith whispered, and her gaze flicked to Eleanor, as if seeking confirmation that she was allowed to say it. A soft sound came from the corridor. A footstep, then another, accompanied by a faint clink that might have been a teacup. The door opened without ceremony, because whoever stood there evidently believed in warmth over formality. Fagin entered, scarf around his neck, a little tray in his hands. The tray held 4 small cups and a plate of something round and golden that looked suspiciously like toasted crumpets. His eyes shone delighted, as though he had discovered a secret gathering. "There you all are," he exclaimed, in a voice pitched to be cheerful without being loud. "As I live and breathe, a whole committee of comfort right here, in one small room. Mrs. Belling told me, with the air of a woman issuing a threat, that you were having tea, and that I might come up if I promised not to spill it." The Dodger's grin flashed. "Did she threaten you?" Fagin gave a theatrical shudder. "My boy, she didn't need to. She merely looked at me, and my hands became steadier of their own accord." Edith sprang up, embarrassed. Mr. Fagin." "I didn't expect—" "Nonsense," Fagin said, sweeping the word away like a crumb. "Expecting is overrated. Besides, I brought reinforcements. Tea and crumpets and a little something else." He set the tray down on the table and lowered his voice with conspiratorial delight. "Butter." Oliver's face brightened the way a hearth brightens when a coal is nudged. "That's very kind," he said. Fagin's eyes softened. "Kindness is my busiest trade," he replied. Then he looked around the room with approval, noticing the sprig of green on the mantel, the neatness, the small, careful comforts. "Miss Harrow, you've made yourself a proper refuge. Well done." Edith colored, but her smile was genuine. "I'm trying," she admitted. "Aren't we all?" Fagin said, and began pouring tea as though it were a blessing he could ladle out. The crumpets, warm and slightly crisp at the edges, went around on the plate. The Dodger took one with theatrical restraint, as if refusing to pounce were a great moral effort. Eleanor accepted hers and tasted simple goodness, warm bread and butter and a faint sweetness. It felt like the kind of food that reassures the body it is safe. Fagin watched them eat with the satisfaction of someone who believed that comfort should be tangible. Then his gaze drifted to Edith's mittens set neatly beside the kettle. "Ah," he murmured, tapping the table lightly. "The famous mittens reunited. Do you know, I've been thinking about that note." Edith's cheeks warmed. "It's framed," she said softly. "I hope that was all right." "All right," Fagin echoed, delighted. "My dear, it's splendid. People come into my shop and see oddments, buttons, ribbons, trinkets, and they think, oh, this is where lost things go. Now they'll see those words and think, perhaps this is where lost feelings go too." The Dodger swallowed a bite and said through crumbs, "Lost feelings should be kept in jars so they don't make a mess." Fagin wagged a finger. "Feelings are like steam, Dodger. Try to jar them, and you'll only fog up the glass." Oliver smiled, and Edith laughed softly. Even Eleanor felt a warmth rise, these small jokes, these gentle truths, threading through the room like a soft scarf. Fagin leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Since we're all here," he said, voice lowering into something more intimate and soothing, "I propose we do something very simple. Not a great ceremony. No, just a small settling." Eleanor's mind returned at once to the coal beads and the dish beneath the kettle. She felt her shoulders loosen in anticipation, as if her body already knew the comfort of naming a worry and letting it go. Fagin reached into his pocket and drew out 4 of the polished coal beads, setting them on the table with soft little clinks. They looked almost like pieces of night made friendly. "I can't help myself," Fagin confessed. "I carry them about like a man carries mints. But these are for the heart, you see." Edith stared, amused and touched. "You really do keep them with you." "How else am I to be prepared for sudden honesty?" Fagin asked, eyes twinkling. "Now. Only if you wish. No one must. But if you do take one and speak one small hope, not a worry this time, a hope, something you're willing to wish for quietly without demanding it arrive at once." The Dodger made a face. "Hopes," he muttered, as if they were inconvenient packages. Fagin's look was affectionate and firm. "Yes, hopes, even yours." Oliver's hand moved first, calm and unafraid. He took a coal bead and held it lightly as though it might warm in his palm. Eleanor took one too. Edith hesitated, then reached out, and her mittened fingers closed around the bead with a little squeeze that looked like courage. The Dodger, grumbling, took the last and held it between finger and thumb, as if it might stain him with sincerity. Fagin nodded toward the hearth. "By the fire," he said. "Come just a step nearer. Let the warmth witness it." They rose and gathered in a small semicircle before the grate. The room glowed around them. The fog outside, held at bay by glass and curtain, became only a pale suggestion. The gas lamp hissed softly, steady as a lullaby. Fagin went first, because he always did. He stepped closer to the fire and placed his coal bead on the mantel beside Edith's buttons and the sprig of greenery. "My hope," he said, voice gentle, "is that people learn they need not arrive perfect at my door. They may arrive rumpled, tired, mistaken, and still be welcome." He stepped back, eyes shining. Oliver moved forward next. He set his bead beside Fagin's. "My hope," he said quietly, "is that when someone is cold inside or out, they find a warm place before they forget what warmth feels like." Edith's breath caught, and she nodded as though the words had touched something tender in her. Eleanor stepped forward. She placed her bead with care, aligning it without thinking, the way her hands always sought order. But this order felt gentle, not strict. "My hope," she said softly, "is that I can do my work without fear. That I can make a mistake and not turn it into a verdict. That I can be steady, but not hard." The fire crackled, approving. Edith stood for a moment, her bead tucked in her mittened palm. She looked at the mantel, at the growing little line of coal beads, and her eyes filled not with panic this time, but with a kind of tender awe, as if she were seeing her own life become possible again. She stepped forward and placed her bead beside the others. "My hope," Edith whispered, "is that I can belong somewhere, that I can knock on a door, any door, and not feel like I'm trespassing simply by existing." Eleanor's chest tightened with compassion. She wanted fiercely and softly for that hope to be answered. The Dodger hovered last, his bead still between his fingers, as if he were deciding whether to drop it into the fire and pretend it had never existed. He glanced at Oliver, at Edith, at Eleanor, and then, unexpectedly, at the sprig of greenery. With a small huff, he stepped forward and placed his bead on the mantel with a little tap. "My hope," he said, and his voice was quieter than usual, "is that folks like us, what have had cold bits in our lives, don't have to keep acting like we're fine all the time. That we can sit by a fire and not feel like we're borrowing it." Fagin's expression softened into something almost paternal. "A very fine hope," he said. The Dodger looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by his own honesty. "Don't go making poetry out of it," he muttered. "No poetry," Fagin promised solemnly. "Only tea." They returned to their places, cups in hand, and the room seemed to settle even deeper into comfort. The mantel now adorned with 4 polished coal beads, 2 buttons, a sprig of green, and the gentle glow of firelight looked like an altar made of ordinary things, an altar for quiet beginnings. Outside, the evening grew darker. The fog thickened into a soft cloak, and the gas lamp's halo grew wider. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked, with patient steadiness, each sound like a small reassurance time is moving. And it is not angry. Mrs. Belling's voice floated up faintly through the floorboards, something about someone leaving crumbs in the parlor, and then subsided. The boarding house seemed content to let their small gathering continue, as if the walls themselves had decided to be forgiving. Edith sipped her tea and glanced at Eleanor. "I didn't think," she said quietly, "that I would have visitors. Not like this. Not friends." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Neither did I," she admitted. Oliver's smile was sleepy and sincere. "It's nice," he murmured. "It is," Edith whispered. Fagin leaned back, watching the fire. "You know," he said, voice drifting into that warm storytelling cadence that made even a small room feel like a larger world, "in my shop people often bring me objects because they cannot bear to throw them away. A ribbon with a frayed edge, a watch that stopped, a button missing its coat. They say it's only a small thing, but it matters to me." He looked around, eyes kind. "And I always think, yes, yes it does. Because it's never only the object. It's the memory, the feeling, the sense of being held together." Eleanor's gaze drifted to Edith's mittens, now folded neatly on the table. A lost mitten, a hidden note, a small phrase that had moved through the fog like a lantern. "Small things matter," Eleanor said softly. "Exactly," Fagin replied. "And if small things can be lost, small things can be found. That is the comfort of it." The Dodger yawned, suddenly unashamed. "I could sleep on this bed," he announced, looking at Edith's neatly made coverlet. Edith laughed. "You most certainly cannot." "Worth a try," he said, closing his mouth quickly as another yawn threatened. "Fog makes me drowsy." "It makes everyone drowsy," Oliver said gently, his head tilting slightly. The hour was sliding toward true night now. The fire had dropped into a slower burn, embers glowing like small rubies. The teacups were nearly empty. Even Fagin's bright energy had softened, as if he too felt the night's hand smoothing the day. At last, Eleanor rose, sensing the natural end of the gathering, an end that was not sad, only restful. "It's late," she said softly. "We should let Edith sleep." Edith nodded, looking both grateful and reluctant to let the warmth disperse. "Yes," she agreed. "But thank you, all of you." Oliver stood polite and careful. "Good night, Edith," he said. "Good night," Edith replied, and there was a new steadiness in her voice. "And thank you, Oliver." The Dodger pushed himself off the bed, stretching like a cat. "Night," he said, then paused at the door, and added, as if it cost him something to be sincere, "You keep that sprig on the mantel. Spring's important." Edith smiled. "I will." Fagin took Edith's hand, briefly warm and gentle. "Good night, my dear," he said. "And remember, my door is always open. Even if you come only to sit near the kettle and say nothing at all." Edith's eyes shone. "Good night, Fagin." Eleanor lingered last. She looked at Edith's face, now softer, less guarded, and felt the quiet satisfaction of an errand completed in the truest sense, not merely returned, but transformed. "Good night," Eleanor said, her voice low and kind. Edith's smile trembled, then steadied. "Good night," she whispered. And thank you for knocking. Eleanor nodded and stepped out into the corridor. The door closed gently behind her, the latch clicking like a soft punctuation mark. They moved down the stairwell together, Fagin, first lantern in hand, Oliver close behind, the Dodger hopping down the steps with exaggerated stealth as if avoiding the creaks were an art form. Eleanor followed her hand gliding along the banister. The stairwell was warm, and the warmth felt almost like a shared secret. On the landing, the framed print of St. Paul's in mist watched them with quiet dignity. Eleanor paused there just for a moment and felt her breath slow. The fog in the picture looked less lonely tonight. At the bottom, the front door opened, and the night met them again, cool and damp and gentle. The fog had thickened, but the gas lamp outside burned with a steady hiss, its halo round and comforting. Oliver stepped out first, then the Dodger, who tipped his cap to Mrs. Belling's unseen authority, even though she was not present. Fagin paused on the step, turning back to Eleanor with a look of warm approval. You did well, he said softly. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with quiet gratitude. We all did, she replied. Fagin's eyes twinkled. Yes, he agreed. That is the best sort of doing together. He stepped into the fog, and for a moment his lantern made a small moving sun. Oliver's gentle figure walked beside him, and the Dodger's cap bobbed like a playful shadow at their side. The three of them moved toward the glow of the street, swallowed gradually by mist and lamplight. Eleanor stood on the threshold for a breath, letting the night's coolness touch her face. The city was hushed, the cobbles shining the gas lamp hissing its steady song. Somewhere a clock chimed faintly. Somewhere a hearth crackled behind a curtain. Then Eleanor went back inside and closed the door softly, keeping the warmth where it belonged. Eleanor climbed the stairs, alone now, the house holding her in its familiar narrow warmth. The banister, worn smooth by years of hands, felt kindly under her palm, as if it remembered every tired lodger who had leaned upon it and offered without words the simple assurance that the next step would still be there. Behind the doors on either side, small lives were settling. A cough softened by quilts, a chair drawn nearer, a grate, a whispered good night that didn't travel far. In the stairwell itself, the warmth from many hearths mingled together, turning the air into something gentle and domestic, like tea steam drifting from one room to the next. Outside beyond the front door and the railings, the fog thickened and rearranged itself in slow, patient folds. The gas lamp on the street continued its steady hiss, faithful as a watchman. Its halo lay upon the pavement like a circle of quiet permission walk. Here, breathe here, be here. Eleanor reached her own door and let herself in without hurry. Her room greeted her with the modest comfort of familiar objects, the little table, her household book, the washstand, the chair with her shawl folded neatly upon it. She added no new coal to the grate. There was already enough, and the coals glowed with a settled, drowsy red, as though they were ready to sleep too. She moved about in small, unhurried motions. She set her reticule down. She loosened her hairpins and let her scalp breathe. She folded her clothes with that quiet care that was not anxiety now, but tenderness, like smoothing the corner of a blanket for someone you mean to comfort. For a moment, she stood by the window, looking out through the glass at the softened street. The fog made everything seem kinder at a distance. The lamp's flame trembled slightly, then steadied again, and in its light, she could see the faint shine of the cobbles, the mild sheen of damp, that caught the glow and held it. Somewhere far off, a carriage wheel sighed. Somewhere nearer, water dripped from a gutter with a soft, patient rhythm, as if the city were counting time in drops instead of minutes. Eleanor thought of Edith, upstairs, her mittens neatly folded, her little sprig of green, insisting on spring. She thought of Oliver's gentle eyes in firelight, and the way his kindness seemed to arrive without effort, as natural as warmth from coals. She thought of Jack Dawkins, quick as a match struck all brightness, and harmless mischief suddenly quiet when hopes were spoken near a hearth. She thought of Fagin's shop of the kettle, that never seemed to sulk of the ledger that made room for lost courage and returned calm. And she thought of the Mitten, how a thing so small could travel through fog and gaslight, gathering people as it went, gathering honesty, gathering forgiveness until it returned, not merely to its owner, but to its meaning. A mitten was meant for warmth. Tonight, it had done its work in a wider way than any wool could have predicted. The night felt in that moment like an old story told by a low fire, one where nothing frightening happened, and yet something true did. A quiet tale where the world did not demand perfection, only presence. Eleanor drew the curtains part way, leaving a narrow seam so the gas lamp's glow could still slip in, softened and safe. Then she turned back to her bed. The sheets were cool at first, then welcoming. The blanket settled over her like a kindly weight. She let her shoulders sink into the pillow jaw, loosening hands, unclenching, as if they had been holding small worries without realizing it. Somewhere below the boarding house clock ticked on steady and unhurried. Each tick seemed to say the same gentle thing now, and now, and now, as if time were not a whip, but a rocking motion. Eleanor's breathing slowed. With each exhale, she felt the day drift further away. Ledgers, steps, streetlight, conversation, cocoa tea. With each inhale, she felt warmth return. Hearth warmth, kettle steam, lamplight, and fog, the quiet companionship of people who did not require her to perform her steadiness like a duty. Outside, the fog pressed softly at the world. The gas lamp hissed with patient devotion. It was not a harsh sound, only a gentle one, like a lullaby whispered by the street itself. If rain returned, it would return as it often did in Southwark, not as a storm, but as a fine, polite tapping against panes, a reminder that the city knew how to speak softly when the hour asked for it. Eleanor's mind, which so often sought faults to examine, found instead a phrase to rest upon. Begin again. That is allowed. It did not feel like an instruction carved in stone. It felt like something written on a warm scrap of paper and tucked close to the heart, kept safe, not hidden away in fear, but held in readiness for the moments when a person forgets she is permitted to be human. In the quiet of her room, Eleanor could almost imagine the boarding house itself breathing warmth, rising through floorboards, drifting into the stairwell, pooling in corners. A shared hearth for shared lives. A place where someone could misplace a mitten or a receipt or an evening's courage and still be met with tea, with light, with a soft knock at the door. The embers in her grate dimmed slightly, then glowed again as a coal settled. The sound was small, satisfying, like a book being closed on a kindly chapter. Eleanor's eyelids grew heavy. Her thoughts softened into images, a chapel gatehouse alcove under steady gaslight, the little tea shop window fogged with warmth, Fagin's shelves crowded with rescued things, Edith's note framed near a kettle that steamed like comfort made visible. And as the night deepened, those images began to slow, to drift, to blur into something gentler, still less like memory. Now, more like a warm haze that could carry her easily towards sleep. This has been Dickensian Sleep Story, and if these Victorian nights bring you comfort, you're always welcome to return. And if you'd like, you can tell us where you're listening from tonight. May the fog outside remain only a soft curtain, and may the gaslight keep its steady halo at a kindly distance. May your room feel warm and sheltered, your blankets pleasantly heavy, your breath quiet and even. May the day's small mistakes loosen their grip and fall away, like damp shaken from a coat at the door. And may forgiveness, simple, steady, undeserved, and yet freely given, sit with you by the hearth until you no longer feel the need to prove you belong there. Let the ticking clock become a gentle metronome for rest. Let the embers dim without worry, knowing they have done their work. Let the city hush itself beyond the pain, and let your thoughts grow softer like wool warmed in a pair of returning mittens. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep deep and safe, as though you were resting in a quiet Southwark room, while the gas lamps hiss kindly in the fog outside.